Hey everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. I remember the first time I stepped into the house, the creaky front door groaning as if it hadn't been opened in years. It was a small two-story place tucked away at the edge of town. The kind of house you'd only notice if you were looking for it, which to be honest, I wasn't. I was just trying to get away, to start fresh after the divorce. I needed space, something quiet, and if this house had a certain darkness about it, well, I didn't mind. It seemed fitting. The landlord was a quiet woman, older than I expected, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. She handed me the keys with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's been vacant for some time," she said, almost as if to reassure me, "but it's a solid place. Just, make sure you check the upstairs window when it rains. Water tends to leak there." I didn't ask any more questions, just nodded and took the keys. I was eager to be done with the paperwork and start unloading my things. The house was exactly what I needed, cheap, isolated, and full of charm. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the air was thick with the scent of old furniture and something musty I couldn't quite place. I didn't mind it at first. It felt authentic in a way. I could hear the sounds of the neighborhood in the distance, but it was quiet here, almost too quiet. The first few days were spent unpacking, trying to get everything into some kind of order. I didn't have much to work with. A couch, a bed, some boxes of books. The walls, a faded yellow, seemed to be closing in on me, but I told myself it was just my nerves. I hadn't had much time to relax lately. I met the neighbors one evening. A couple of houses down, a man named Bill waved at me from his porch as I was dragging a box of books to the front door. He looked like he'd been in the neighborhood forever, worn jeans and a trucker cap, but his eyes were sharp. "You new here?" he asked, his voice gruff but friendly. "You're in the old Pierce house, right?" "Yeah, just moved in," I said, setting the box down. "It's nice. Quiet." Bill's smile faltered for a second. "It's quiet, all right. Too quiet sometimes. A lot of people come and gone from that place. You know, there's a rumor it's cursed." I laughed it off, thinking he was just making small talk. "Cursed? Really?" He didn't laugh with me. "I'm serious. Last guy who lived there ran out in the middle of the night, babbling about footsteps and shadows that moved. Crazy stuff. And before him, a woman, she left and never came back. Said she heard things in the walls. There's always been oddness around that house." I frowned, uneasy but not willing to admit it. "I think I'll be fine." Bill didn't seem convinced, but he shrugged and went back inside without another word. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house. The windows stared back at me, blank and dark. The first night was when I noticed the sounds. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises, everyone knows that. But this was different. It started softly, like the sound of heavy boots dragging across the floor above me. I didn't think much of it at first, but the longer I listened, the more it seemed like someone, or something, was walking around upstairs. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was the old pipes or the wind rattling the house. I went to bed, turning on a fan to drown out the noise. But the sounds didn't stop. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just walking. It was as if someone was pacing, waiting. I lay there in the dark, frozen under the covers, the ticking of the old clock in the hall the only thing louder than the thumping of my heart. The footsteps stopped, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The silence in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like something was waiting just beyond my vision. In the morning, the house seemed normal again. The sun was up, the air fresh, and the creaking of the floorboard seemed harmless. But the memory of the footsteps lingered in my mind. I pushed it away, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Old houses, after all, have a way of making you feel things that aren't really there. But I knew something was wrong. Something that wasn't just the house settling. That night, I stayed up a little longer than usual, reading a book on the couch, trying to ignore the nagging sense that I was being watched. It wasn't until I heard the footsteps again, louder this time, that I realized how quiet the house had become. There was no creaking of the floors downstairs, no rustling from the old wooden beams. Only those slow, deliberate steps from upstairs. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen and crept toward the stairs. The beam of light flickered in the dark, casting long shadows on the walls. Each step creaked beneath my feet as I moved toward the stairs, but the sounds above me didn't stop. They were still there, slow and steady, like someone walking back and forth, waiting for me to follow. I reached the top of the stairs and paused. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by a single light bulb flickering from the ceiling. I could feel the chill in the air, the kind that runs deep into your bones. The house felt colder here, as if it were breathing on its own. The footsteps stopped. I stood frozen, my heart racing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing came. The silence was deafening. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the far end of the hall. It was my name. I turned and ran back downstairs, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't look back. When I reached the bottom, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for breath. My pulse thudded in my ears. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in this house. And I wasn't sure I wanted to find out who, or what, was still up there. The next day, I tried to pretend that the events of the night before hadn't happened. It was a nice, clear morning, and the house seemed like any other. Creaky floors, old windows, a faint smell of mildew in the corners. I could hear birds chirping outside, the sun spilling through the living room window. Everything felt normal. Almost too normal. I didn't go back upstairs that morning. I couldn't bring myself to. The idea of those footsteps, the soft whispering of my name, no, I wasn't ready to face that again. So I spent the day cleaning, rearranging my few possessions, trying to make the place feel more like home, even if it didn't quite feel right. There wasn't much, but it kept my mind busy. I tried to remind myself that it was just an old house. People say these things happen in old places, creaky boards, strange sounds. It was nothing. That's what I told myself over and over, until the thoughts felt more like an echo in my head than something real. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, an unease that I couldn't shake. That evening, I ventured outside to get some fresh air. The house was tucked away behind thick trees, a little further than the other homes on the street. As I walked toward the sidewalk, I noticed Bill sitting on his porch again, his cap pulled low over his eyes, his legs stretched out on the railing. He looked up as I passed, and I gave him a small wave. "Everything okay?" Bill asked, his voice low, like he already knew the answer. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if I could be convincing. "Yeah, just getting used to the place." He studied me for a moment, then stood up, his old joints creaking like the house. "You hear anything last night?" My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He looked down the street as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "The footsteps. Or whispers. Most people who live there, they'll tell you it's just the house settling, but I don't know. The people who lived there before you? They didn't stick around long. Most of them left in a hurry. Weird things, strange noises at night. One of them even saw someone standing at the end of the hallway just staring at him." I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment I couldn't speak. Bill wasn't the type to joke about things like that. He seemed serious, his face set in a grim expression. "I know it sounds crazy, but," Bill continued, lowering his voice, "I'd be careful up there. People say the place has a history. You don't want to mess with it." I forced myself to laugh, though it came out sounding strained. "Yeah, thanks. I'll be fine." Bill didn't say anything else. He just gave me a long look before turning and heading inside his house. I stood there for a moment, staring at the ground, trying to ignore the racing thoughts in my head. What did he mean, a history? And what kind of history could this old house have? Was it just local gossip, or was there something to it? That night, I decided to take a different approach. I wouldn't let myself get caught up in the fear. I'd stay calm, stay rational. I was determined not to let my imagination get the best of me. So I stayed downstairs, sprawled out on the couch with the television on in the background. The sound of an old movie filled the room, but my mind wasn't on it. I kept glancing toward the staircase, half expecting to hear those footsteps again. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. A soft, creaking noise from above. Slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around upstairs. My heart began to pound in my chest, but I forced myself to stay still, to keep my breathing steady. It's just the house settling. That's all it is. I kept telling myself that over and over. The sound grew louder, closer. It was impossible to ignore now. Someone was walking around up there. Heavy footsteps, dragging along the wooden floorboards. I knew I should go check, that I had to, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed at me to go upstairs, but my body was frozen, paralyzed with fear. And then there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a normal knock. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was testing the door to see if it would open. My pulse raced in my ears as I crept toward the door, feeling like every step I took was too loud. I couldn't see anyone through the peephole, but the presence outside felt wrong. I stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my breath shallow. Should I open it? Should I just leave it locked? The footsteps upstairs had stopped, replaced by a silence that felt even worse. The door knocker tapped again, and this time I couldn't stop myself from opening the door just a crack. Nothing. No one was there. I stepped back, my heart hammering. Maybe it was just a prank, maybe it was Bill playing some kind of twisted joke. But the feeling didn't go away. The silence was thick now, pressing against my chest. My eyes darted up the stairs, expecting to see something. Someone standing at the top, watching me. But the stairs were empty. The house was still. For a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining things. I was so tired, so anxious from the last few days that it must have just been a mix of fear and exhaustion. But then, as I turned back toward the living room, I heard it again. A whisper. Soft, like the wind, but unmistakably clear. It was my name. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my jacket, slammed the door behind me, and ran out into the night. I couldn't stay there. Not after what had happened. Not after what I'd heard. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stand being in that house any longer. Not with whatever was waiting inside. I needed to find answers. And I had a feeling the house wasn't going to let me go until I did. I don't know how long I walked. I didn't really care. I just needed to get as far away from that house as possible. The cold air bit at my skin, and I could barely feel my feet as they slapped against the pavement. The night was unusually quiet, the usual noises of the city muted, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I couldn't bring myself to return home. Not yet. Eventually, my legs started to ache, and I found myself at a small diner on the edge of town. It was empty, save for the waitress behind the counter and a few tired souls sipping coffee in the corner. The neon sign buzzed overhead, flickering like a heartbeat in the dark. I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling. The waitress gave me a glance but didn't say anything as I slid into a booth by the window. I ordered coffee, though I didn't feel like drinking it. The warmth from the cup only made me feel more restless. The more I tried to focus on the hum of the diner, the more my mind kept drifting back to the house. I couldn't shake the image of the door knocking, the footsteps, the whispers. What was going on? Was it just my imagination, or was something actually wrong with that place? I almost jumped out of my skin when the waitress returned with my coffee. She gave me a long look, almost like she was trying to read me. "You all right, hon?" she asked, her voice thick with a southern accent. "You don't look too good." I didn't know how to answer. Was I all right? I didn't feel all right. But I forced a smile, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Just tired, I guess." She nodded slowly, but then, as if something had clicked, she leaned in a little closer. "That house you're renting, on Oak Street?" I froze, my grip tightening around the coffee cup. How did she know? She didn't seem to notice my discomfort. "I used to live there. A long time ago. It's not a place for the faint of heart." I set the cup down, the warm liquid sloshing over the rim. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. The waitress paused, as if she was weighing whether or not to continue. She glanced toward the back of the diner, then leaned in a little closer. "People say the house is cursed. I'm not sure if I believe in that kind of stuff, but there's something about it, something off. It's always been like that, you know? The last tenant I remember, poor guy, he ran out of there in the middle of the night, screaming. Said there were voices. Said something was in the walls calling him. He wouldn't stop talking about it until the ambulance showed up. They said he was having a nervous breakdown, but you could tell he wasn't right. He was different after that night. My blood ran cold, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This couldn't be a coincidence. The footsteps, the whispers, everything was adding up in a way that made my stomach turn. Who else? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Who else lived there? The waitress looked around again, this time catching my eye with a strange expression. She seemed almost reluctant. But then she spoke, her voice low and secretive. Before him there was a woman. She was obsessed with that place, always talking about the history. She thought there was something in the walls, something buried beneath the foundation. People said she was crazy, but I don't know. She got so paranoid she started talking to herself. She was trying to break down the walls, even to find whatever was hidden. But then one night she just disappeared. Never saw her again. Left all her things behind, like she just vanished. I tried to process her words, but my brain was spinning. A woman obsessed with the house? Voices in the walls? I thought back to Bill's warning. People say the place has a history. I knew that I couldn't ignore this. There was something in that house, something dark and twisted, something that didn't want to be found. And it wasn't going to leave me alone. You said something was buried beneath the foundation, I said, my voice a little shaky now. Do you know what it is? She shook her head. I don't know. I never really looked into it. But the house has always had a reputation, you know? People don't stay there long. It gets into your head, makes you see things. People start hearing noises. And before you know it, they're gone. I stood up, the idea of staying in the diner any longer feeling suffocating. "Thanks," I muttered, still in shock from everything I just heard. "Be careful, Han," she called after me as I turned to leave. That place, it doesn't let go. I stepped outside into the cold night air, my mind reeling. I couldn't go back to that house without knowing more. I had to understand what had happened there, what had caused all these strange occurrences. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I couldn't live in fear anymore. I needed answers. So I made up my mind. The next day I'd go back to that house. I'd find the history of the place, whether it was through the old records or through whatever clues I could dig up. I wasn't going to let whatever was haunting me keep me in the dark any longer. I wasn't afraid. At least that's what I told myself. But as I walked back toward the house, I couldn't help but notice the way the trees seemed to stretch above me, casting long, twisted shadows across the street. The house stood at the end of the block, its windows dark and silent, watching me. And for the first time, I wondered if it was watching me, or if it was waiting for me. The next morning, the house looked different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something in the air that felt thicker, heavier, like it was waiting for me. The sun barely managed to filter through the clouds, casting a grayish light over the street. The house, once so imposing in its silence, now seemed almost alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside, just beyond the walls, watching me. I took a deep breath and walked up the creaky stairs, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door was locked, of course, but the key was always in the same spot, beneath the doormat, just like Bill had said. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. It wasn't the old musty scent I'd grown used to. No, this was different, faint but unmistakable. It smelled like damp earth, like something decaying beneath the floorboards. I wrinkled my nose and stepped further into the entryway, trying to push the feeling of dread aside. The house didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a trap. I couldn't bring myself to go upstairs just yet, not with the weight of everything I'd learned the night before hanging over me. I made my way to the living room, hoping to distract myself, but the moment I entered, something caught my eye. It was a small wooden box on the coffee table, almost hidden under a pile of old magazines. I didn't remember seeing it there before. Without thinking, I walked over to it, my hand reaching for the lid. As my fingers brushed against the wood, a chill ran through my spine. I opened the box slowly, almost hesitantly, as if expecting something to leap out at me. Inside, there was nothing but a yellowed piece of paper. It looked ancient, fragile, like it had been sitting there for decades. My heart raced as I carefully unfolded it, revealing a series of strange symbols and markings that seemed to dance on the page. At first glance, it looked like gibberish, but I could tell that it was more than that. It was a map, of sorts, a map of the house. My eyes scanned the page, tracing the lines and shapes, and then I froze. In the corner of the map, there was a small X marked in bold ink. It wasn't far from the living room, just behind the walls, right where I was standing. The feeling of being watched returned, more intense this time. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. I had to know what it meant. I had to understand what was hidden in this house. My hands trembled as I shoved the paper back into the box and slid it into my bag. Without a second thought, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed for the stairs. I wasn't going to be scared anymore. I was going to find out what was really going on here. The stairs creaked under my weight, groaning with each step as I made my way up. The higher I went, the darker it seemed to get, the air growing colder as if the house itself was becoming more hostile. The top of the stairs was just as I remembered it, quiet, still, but different. The sense of something lurking just beyond my reach was overwhelming now. I glanced down at the map once more, trying to figure out where to start. The X marked a place in the wall behind the living room, where the fireplace was. The thought of breaking into the walls was ridiculous, but I couldn't let it go. There was something there. Something that was waiting for me. I pushed open the door to the room, half expecting it to creak louder than it did. But there was nothing. The room looked exactly like it had the first time I'd walked through it. Old furniture, a few scattered books, and the fireplace in the corner. The crackling sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears as I slowly approached the hearth. The fireplace was cold, empty. Nothing about it seemed unusual, but something about the area around it made me uneasy. I knelt down, running my fingers over the stones, feeling for any irregularities. After a moment, I found it, a small metal ring hidden beneath the dust. My heart stopped. I pulled at the ring, and with a soft creak, the stone shifted, revealing a small compartment in the wall. Inside there was a dusty old book bound in cracked leather. I could barely breathe as I reached for it, my fingers shaking with anticipation. The moment I touched the book, I felt it, a sudden cold rush that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something otherworldly, something that shouldn't have been there. I pulled the book free from the compartment and opened it to the first page. The writing was in a language I didn't understand, but the symbols were eerily similar to those I had seen on the paper. As I flipped through the pages, I could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on me, suffocating me. Each page seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, as if the house itself was breathing through the book. A sound behind me stopped me cold. A creak, slow and deliberate. I didn't need to turn around to know something was there. Something was waiting. I stood up quickly, clutching the book to my chest. My heart raced and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. Then, just like that, the noise stopped. Dead silence. I didn't wait to see what was behind me. I bolted out of the room, down the stairs and out the door, not daring to look back. As I stood in the yard, gasping for breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was calling me, urging me to return. It was more than just a feeling now. It was a presence. Something dark, something old. And it was only a matter of time before it found me again. The next few days were a blur. The house seemed to linger in my mind, like a shadow that never left. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I went to work, spent time in town, but nothing felt normal. The house was always there, just at the edge of my thoughts, waiting for me to return. I hadn't gone back since the night I discovered the book. I couldn't bring myself to. Each time I thought about it, a wave of dread washed over me. Something inside that house didn't want to be disturbed, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. But I couldn't ignore it forever. I had to know what the book meant. I had to know why the house felt so wrong. One evening, after work, I found myself standing in front of the house again. It was dark, the sky thick with clouds, and the air was unnaturally still. My hands shook as I reached for the key beneath the mat, the cold metal sending a jolt of fear through me. I opened the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The house greeted me with its usual silence, but it felt different tonight. The air inside was thick, like I was stepping into something heavier. The smell of decay was stronger too. I could almost taste it in the back of my throat. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't have come back. But there I was, standing in the foyer, holding my breath, wondering if I was about to make a terrible mistake. The book was still in my bag. I had brought it with me, not knowing what else to do with it. I hadn't dared to open it again. Not until now. I made my way to the living room and set the book on the coffee table. The moment I placed it down, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of being watched. My skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just out of sight, waiting for me to do something. I took a deep breath and opened the book, the pages creaking under my fingertips. The writing was still foreign, but this time, something was different. The symbols seemed to shift, almost as though they were alive, moving across the page. I skimmed through the book, my eyes scanning the pages. There were more drawings, more symbols, rituals, spells, and something else, something darker. A sense of foreboding crept over me as I read one passage aloud, almost against my will. To summon what lies beneath, one must open the door. To release what is bound by blood, by flesh, by the very foundation of the house. The words seemed to echo in my head, reverberating with a power I couldn't explain. My heart raced, and I slammed the book shut, the sound of it thudding against the table like a drumbeat. That's when I heard it. A noise, soft at first, but growing louder. It was a low, rumbling sound, like the house itself was groaning, shifting. The walls seemed to vibrate, and the floor beneath me felt like it was pulsing, alive. I stood frozen, unable to move. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The room grew colder, the air thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps. Slow and uneven, like someone dragging their feet across the floor above me. They moved down the hallway toward the stairs and then stopped. I didn't dare look up. I couldn't let whatever was up there know that I knew. The footsteps began again, but this time they were closer. They were coming down the stairs, step by slow step, as if whoever was walking was savoring the moment. Each footfall was louder than the last, and I could hear the creak of the old wooden steps beneath their weight. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, my legs unsteady beneath me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. A cold, clammy hand brushed the back of my neck and I gasped, spinning around. There was nothing there. Just empty air. But the feeling, oh, the feeling, it was unmistakable. Something was standing behind me just out of sight. I could feel its presence like a dark cloud hanging over me, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. I stumbled backward, the book still clutched in my hand, my feet scrambling for purchase on the floor. I ran for the door, my pulse pounding in my ears, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't look back as I burst out of the house and into the cold night air. The house loomed behind me, silent once more, but I knew it wasn't done with me. I didn't stop running until I reached the diner, the familiar neon sign flickering in the distance. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and I collapsed into a booth, my chest heaving with each breath. The waitress, the same one from the other night, gave me a worried look. "You all right, hon?" she asked softly. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I was. "No," I whispered. "No, I'm not all right." I didn't know what was happening to me, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that house, it was real. And it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I could feel its eyes on me even now. I could feel it watching me, waiting for the next time I would return. I couldn't stay away. No matter how terrified I was, something inside me kept pushing me back toward the house. It was like a magnetic force I couldn't resist, drawing me in no matter how much I wanted to escape. I spent the next few days trying to push it out of my mind, working, running errands, doing anything to distract myself. But there was a constant pressure in the back of my mind, a voice whispering that I had to go back, that I had to understand what was really happening. It was on the third night after my last encounter that I gave in. I found myself standing in front of the house again, key in hand, staring at the door as though I had no control over my own body. The night was still, the air thick with an eerie calmness that only made the dread grow stronger. The house stood like a looming presence, its windows black and empty, watching me, waiting. I almost turned around and left. I should have, but I didn't. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of decay and dust immediately enveloping me. The house was silent, but I knew better than to trust that silence. It was only the calm before the storm. It always was. My footsteps echoed in the dark hallway as I made my way toward the living room, where I had found the book. The light from the moon filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as if they were alive. I could feel the house around me, the weight of its history, the strange energy that pulsed through every wall. I set the book down on the coffee table again, hesitating for a moment before opening it. The symbols, the language, they were all still the same. But this time, something was different. The air felt heavier, as if the book itself was waiting for me to do something. I flipped through the pages, my fingers trembling, until I came across a section I hadn't seen before. The words seemed to pull me in, hypnotizing me, as if the house was guiding me, urging me to read. Asterisk: to break the seal, one must open the door that was closed by blood. The price must be paid and the curse will be released. One life must be offered to the house. Asterisk. My heart skipped a beat as I read the words aloud, a sense of dread crawling up my spine. I had no idea what it meant, but I knew it was important. I couldn't stop reading. The words seemed to call to me, to promise me something. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I needed to find it. A sound broke my concentration, a soft tapping like fingernails tapping against the wood. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then the tapping came again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from inside the room, though. It was coming from the walls. The same walls that had been silent for so long. I dropped the book and stood up, my heart racing. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as if something, or someone, was trapped inside the walls trying to get out. I reached out for the walls, pressing my hands against them, hoping to find an answer. But all I could feel was the coldness, the unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was overwhelming, and then it came again. But this time it wasn't tapping. It was something else. Something deeper. The sound was like a heavy breath, slow, labored, coming from somewhere far beyond the walls. I could hear it clearly, as if it were right beside me. I turned around, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, any explanation for what I was hearing. But there was nothing. And then I felt it. A cold, clammy presence brushed against the back of my neck, a sensation that made my entire body freeze. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The words from the book echoed in my mind. One life must be offered to the house. I stepped back slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had to get out of there. I had to leave before whatever was in the walls, or whatever was coming for me, found me. I turned to the door and froze. The door was gone. In its place was a solid wall. The wooden doorframe was replaced by rough, crumbling stone, as if the house had swallowed it whole. Panic surged through me. I pounded on the wall with my fists, screaming for the door to open, but it didn't budge. My chest tightened and the air grew colder. I could feel the presence behind me growing stronger, more insistent. My heart raced, and I knew that whatever had been waiting for me was here. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. There, standing in the center of the room, was a figure, a dark silhouette that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. It was tall, thin, and for a split second I thought I saw a face twisted in pain and rage. But then the figure moved and I couldn't make out its form. It blurred, shifting like smoke, and for a brief moment I thought it might be gone. But no. It was still there, standing just out of reach, its presence suffocating the air. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was run. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the shifting shadow, until I felt the cold wall behind me. There was no way out. I was trapped. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the room. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the air itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure lunged toward me. I screamed, but no sound came out. The world went black. I woke up to silence. No growl, no shifting shadows, no oppressive presence crushing the air out of my lungs. For a fleeting moment, I thought I was somewhere else, back in my old apartment, safe under my worn quilt, with the hum of the city outside my window. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in through the filthy, warped glass, the truth crashed down on me like a wave. I was still in the house. The cold was the first thing I felt. It wasn't just a physical chill, but something deeper, something that wrapped itself around my heart and refused to let go. The floor beneath me was hard and uneven, and when I tried to push myself up, sharp pain lanced through my palms. I looked down to find small cuts across my hands as if I'd been clawing at something rough. I blinked and tried to remember what had happened. The figure, the growl, the door disappearing. The way the walls had seemed to close in around me, trapping me like a fly in a spider's web. My chest tightened at the memory, but the details were hazy, blurred as though my mind was trying to shield me from fully understanding. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. The room looked different. The furniture was still there, the coffee table with the book I'd found, the sagging couch against the far wall. But the walls were covered in deep, jagged scratches, as though some enormous creature had been clawing its way out. The air felt heavier now, charged with something I couldn't name. I took a step forward, my footfalls echoing unnaturally in the empty space. The sound sent shivers racing down my spine. And then I saw it. The book. It was still on the coffee table, but it wasn't the same. The leather cover had darkened, now a deep, almost black crimson that seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me not to go near it, but my body seemed to move on its own. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cover. The room seemed to shift. The floor beneath me warped, the air around me rippling as though I were underwater. I stumbled back, clutching the book in my hands as a low hum began to fill the room. It wasn't a sound I could hear exactly, but I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach, a deep, resonant vibration that made my teeth ache. I opened the book without meaning to, the pages flipping wildly until they settled on a single passage, written in a spidery script that hadn't been there before. The ink glistened as if freshly written, and the words seemed to burn themselves into my brain as I read them. Asterisk, the house binds you. The dead is yours. To leave is to invite the shadow into the world beyond. Stay and it remains contained. One life for its freedom, asterisk. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. The words echoed in my mind, their meaning clear even as I tried to deny it. The house had trapped me. And worse, it wasn't just haunting me. It wanted something from me. No, I whispered, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But the house answered. A deep, resonant thud echoed through the floorboards, shaking the walls and sending a cloud of dust raining down from the ceiling. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I couldn't stay in that room. I clutched the book to my chest and bolted, my feet slipping on the uneven floor as I ran into the hallway. The sound followed me, growing louder, closer, until I could feel it vibrating through the soles of my feet. I didn't know where I was going. Every hallway seemed to twist in on itself, the walls narrowing, the doors disappearing as I passed them. The house was changing around me, reshaping itself into a labyrinth with no exit. Let me out. I screamed, my voice breaking. Please let me out. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was thick, oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. And then, faintly, I heard something new. A whisper. It was so soft I almost didn't hear it, but it was there, just on the edge of my perception. Stay? The voice was coming from behind me. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't look, but I couldn't help myself. I turned slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. There was nothing there, or so I thought. At first, all I saw was darkness, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly into the space where the hallway should have been. But then the darkness moved. It coalesced, forming a shape, a figure that was all wrong, its edges blurred and shifting, its form twisting in ways that made my eyes ache to look at it. And then it stepped toward me. The air grew colder with every step it took, and I found myself backing away, my legs moving on their own as the book slipped from my hands and thudded to the floor. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if curious, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in its shadowy face. Or what used to be eyes, two hollow pits that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. You cannot leave, the voice said, echoing inside my mind. The debt must be paid. I stumbled back, my back hitting the cold, unyielding wall. What do you want from me? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, long, thin fingers stretching toward me. I felt the air around me grow colder, tighter, as if the house itself was closing in on me. And then everything went dark. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of the hallway. My body ached as though I'd been crushed under something heavy, and my head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pain. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then the memories flooded back, crashing over me like icy waves. The figure, the voice, the words from the book. I scrambled to my feet, looking around in a panic. The hallway was eerily silent, the oppressive darkness that had swallowed me moments before now replaced by dim, flickering light. The overhead bulb swung lazily, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I clutched at the wall to steady myself. The book was gone. I glanced around, my eyes darting to every corner, every crack in the floorboards. It was nowhere to be seen. My heart sank. As much as I hated that cursed object, it felt like the only thread connecting me to whatever was happening in this house. Without it, I was completely in the dark. And then I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like the whisper of fabric brushing against wood. It was coming from somewhere below me. The basement. I'd avoided the basement ever since I'd moved in. The door to it was one of the first things I'd noticed. A heavy, iron-reinforced slab of wood at the end of the kitchen, with an old padlock that looked more decorative than functional. I'd never even tried to open it. Something about it had always felt wrong. Now I didn't have a choice. I made my way downstairs, each step creaking loudly in the stillness of the house. The air grew colder as I descended, and a faint metallic tang filled my nose. The kitchen was dim, the faint light from the single bulb overhead casting distorted shadows across the countertops. The basement door loomed at the far end of the room, its surface marred with deep scratches as though someone, or something, had tried to claw its way through. The padlock was gone. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. I hesitated, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But I couldn't. Not yet. Whatever was happening, whatever this house wanted, it wasn't going to let me go until I faced it. I reached out and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, a pungent, suffocating mix of damp earth, rust, and something else, something acrid and sickly sweet that made my stomach churn. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, the wood warped and splintered with age. I hesitated for a moment, then began my descent, each step creaking loudly under my weight. The basement was vast, much larger than I'd expected. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture that gleamed faintly in the dim light from a single bare bulb hanging overhead. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and riddled with cracks that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. And at the center of the room there it was. The book. It lay open on a crude wooden table, its pages glowing faintly in the dim light. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to writhe and shift as I approached, like living things trying to escape the confines of the parchment. My breath caught in my throat and I hesitated, unsure if I should go any closer. Then I heard the whispering. It was soft at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But as I stepped closer to the table, it grew louder, more distinct. Dozens of voices, overlapping and merging into a cacophony of sound that seemed to come from all around me. They were speaking in a language I didn't understand, their words sharp and guttural, yet somehow familiar. I reached the table and stared down at the book. The page it was open to was blank, but as I looked closer, words began to form, scrawling themselves across the surface in dark, dripping ink. Asterisk, you are the key. The door must remain closed. One life for its freedom, asterisk. The same words as before, but this time there was more. Beneath the ominous message, a single name appeared in jagged, uneven script. Jonas Aldrich. My blood ran cold. Jonas Aldrich. The name was familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. And then it hit me, the previous owner of the house. The man the neighbor had mentioned in passing, the one who had supposedly disappeared without a trace. The one who'd been obsessed with the occult. This was his work, his legacy, and now it was mine. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt an unbearable pressure building in the room, pressing down on me from all sides. The air grew colder, and my breath came out in white puffs as frost began to form on the edges of the table. And then, from the shadows, I saw it. The figure. It was the same as before, its form shifting and warping in the darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on me. But this time it wasn't alone. Shadows moved with it, shapes barely distinguishable from the gloom, their forms flickering and writhing like smoke. You cannot escape, the voice said, echoing in my mind. The debt must be paid. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the table. I fell, the impact jarring my bones, but I didn't look away from the figure. It was coming closer now, the shadows stretching out toward me like grasping hands. In a panic, I reached for the book. My fingers closed around its edges, and I lifted it, holding it like a shield between myself and the encroaching darkness. The effect was immediate. The shadows recoiled, the figure halting in its tracks. The whispers turned to screams, a deafening cacophony that filled the room as the air grew impossibly cold. My breath came in ragged gasps as I held the book tighter, the symbols on its surface glowing brighter and brighter until they burned like fire. And then, with a deafening roar, the figure lunged. The figure lunged, and the world seemed to collapse around me. I barely had time to react before it was upon me, its hollow, gaping eyes fixed on mine. The shadows writhed like living things, surging forward, their icy tendrils brushing against my skin. It felt as though the air itself was being sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping for breath. In desperation, I held the book out in front of me like a weapon. The symbols burned brighter, and the shadows recoiled again, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were being torn apart by some unseen force. The figure halted, its form flickering and shifting as though it were caught between this world and another. "You don't belong here," I shouted, my voice trembling. "Leave me alone." The figure tilted its head, its movements unnervingly slow, almost curious. Then it spoke, its voice echoing in my mind like 1,000 overlapping whispers. "You hold the key. The door cannot remain closed forever." The room began to shake, the floor trembling beneath me as the walls groaned and cracked. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and the oppressive cold deepened, sinking into my bones. I clutched the book tighter, its heat searing my palms but anchoring me to reality. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The figure and its shadows withdrew, melting back into the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I dropped the book onto the table, staring at it as though it might spring to life. My hands were trembling, my skin blistered where the symbols had burned me. The words on the page had changed again, the ink still wet and glistening. Asterisk, you cannot run. The house is alive, asterisk. I stumbled backward, my legs threatening to give out. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened, what the figure had meant. The house was alive. What did that even mean? I needed answers. Fumbling in the dim light, I grabbed my phone from my pocket and opened a search engine. Jonas Aldrich. The name felt like a lifeline, the only connection I had to the madness unfolding around me. As I typed, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely hit the right keys, I braced myself for whatever I might find. The results were sparse but chilling. Jonas Aldrich had been a professor of anthropology at a nearby university, specializing in ancient rituals and occult practices. He had purchased the house decades ago, shortly after his wife's sudden and unexplained death. Rumors swirled about his obsession with contacting the dead, his experiments in the occult, and his ultimate descent into madness. One article stood out. It was from an old yellowed newspaper scan, the headline reading, "Local professor missing after bizarre incident at historic home." The article detailed how neighbors had reported strange lights and sounds coming from the house in the weeks leading up to Aldrich's disappearance. One witness claimed to have seen him standing in the front yard late at night, speaking to someone who wasn't there. When the police finally entered the house, they found it empty, save for a single journal lying open on the floor. A chill ran down my spine. The journal. It had to be the same one I'd found in the attic. My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of it all. If Aldrich had disappeared, where had he gone? And why was his presence, his legacy, still so deeply rooted in this house? I needed to see that journal again. I hurried up the stairs, the creaking floorboards echoing in the silence. The attic door loomed at the end of the hallway, its surface warped and splintered. I hesitated for a moment, the memory of the figure still fresh in my mind, then pushed it open and stepped inside. The journal was still there, lying on the floor where I had left it. I picked it up, the worn leather cover cool and rough under my fingertips. The pages were filled with Aldrich's cramped handwriting, the ink smudged in places as though he had been writing in a frenzy. Flipping through the pages, I found myself drawn to one particular entry, the date circled in red ink. June 3rd, 1974. The writing was jagged and uneven, the words barely legible. Asterisk, the door is open. I can feel it breathing, watching. I thought I could control it, but it's too strong. It wants more. It wants me. I hear them at night, the voices, the footsteps. They're coming closer. I don't know how much longer I can hold them off. Asterisk. The entry ended abruptly, the last word trailing off as though Aldrich had been interrupted. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was one of madness and despair. Aldrich had opened some kind of door, a portal to something beyond this world. And now it was my problem to deal with. As I turned to leave the attic, the door slammed shut behind me. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The room was plunged into darkness, the faint light from the hallway snuffed out as though it had never existed. The air grew heavy, the silence oppressive. And then, from somewhere in the shadows, I heard it. A voice. You can't escape. My grip tightened on the journal as I turned in circles, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The voice was closer now, whispering in my ear, filling my mind with a cacophony of sound. You hold the key. The door must open. The walls began to close in, the shadows swallowing everything around me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I clutched at the journal like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness receded. The attic door creaked open, revealing the dim light of the hallway beyond. I didn't hesitate. Clutching the journal to my chest, I ran. The hallway felt like a tunnel, stretching longer and darker with every step I took. The journal clutched against my chest seemed to thrum faintly, a heartbeat of its own that matched the fear pounding in my ears. Each creak of the floorboards beneath me felt amplified, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this house. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following me, just beyond the edge of the light. Reaching the safety of the living room, I collapsed onto the couch, breathless and shaking. The journal was still in my hands, its leather cover warm now, as if it had absorbed the heat of my panic. The words from the attic echoed in my mind. Asterisk, you hold the key. The door must open. Asterisk. What door? And what had Jonas Aldrich unleashed here? I opened the journal again, flipping through the brittle pages with urgency. Every line of text seemed like a warning, every smudged word a cry for help. Aldrich's descent into madness was documented in chilling detail. His experiments with rituals, his belief that he could communicate with the dead, and his growing paranoia as the house seemed to turn against him. One entry stood out, written in bold letters, underlined twice. Do not trust the mirrors. I froze, my gaze darting to the antique mirror hanging over the fireplace. It was one of the house's original fixtures, its ornate frame carved with strange symbols I had never noticed before. The glass reflected the room in eerie detail, but something about it seemed off. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the mirror, a flicker of shadow that didn't belong to me. I leaned forward, my breath fogging the glass, and stared into my own reflection. Don't, a voice whispered behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. It was Mrs. Hargrove, my neighbor. She stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and urgency. You shouldn't look too closely, she said, her voice trembling. The house, it shows you things. Things you don't want to see. How did you? I began, but she cut me off, stepping further into the room. I told you to leave, she said. I told you this house wasn't safe. You didn't listen. I couldn't just leave, I said, my voice shaky. What's happening here? What did Jonas Aldrich do? Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, her gaze darting to the journal in my hands. He opened a door that should have stayed closed. He thought he could control it, but he was wrong. The house, it feeds on people. Their fears, their memories. It takes and takes until there's nothing left. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. What about the mirrors? Her face darkened, and she glanced at the mirror over the fireplace. They're not just reflections. They're windows. It watches you through them, learns about you. And sometimes it shows you things to scare you, or to tempt you. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do I do? Mrs. Hargrove shook her head. I don't know. No one's ever been able to stop it. The only thing you can do is leave and never look back. I wanted to tell her that I couldn't just walk away, but the words caught in my throat. The journal felt heavier in my hands, the air around me thicker. You don't understand, I said. It won't let me leave. I've tried. Her expression hardened. Then you need to end it. Whatever Jonah started, you need to finish it. That's the only way. How? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. She glanced at the journal. Everything you need is in there. But be careful. The house doesn't want you to stop it. It will fight back. Before I could say anything else, she turned and left, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Alone again, I sat there, staring at the journal in my lap. My thoughts raced, the weight of Mrs. Hargrove's warning pressing down on me. The house felt alive now, its presence palpable in every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls. The mirrors seemed to watch me, their surfaces shimmering faintly as though they were holding back something unspeakable. I flipped through the journal again, my eyes scanning the pages for anything that might tell me how to end it. One passage caught my attention, written in large, hurried letters. Asterisk, the heart of the house is the source. Destroy it and the door will close. But beware, it will not let you go easily. Asterisk. The heart of the house. What did that mean? The basement? The attic? As if in response to my thoughts, a loud thud echoed from the basement door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came again, louder this time, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor below. The journal's pages fluttered in a non-existent breeze, and my gaze was drawn to the final entry, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, if you're reading this, it means I failed. The house is stronger than I thought. But you might succeed where I couldn't. Find the heart. Destroy it. And pray it doesn't destroy you first. Asterisk. I stared at the basement door, my heart pounding. The house seemed to pulse around me, its presence more oppressive than ever. I didn't have a choice. Clutching the journal, I stood and made my way toward the basement. The door loomed before me, its surface warped and splintered, as though it had been fighting to contain whatever was on the other side. With a deep breath, I reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. Whatever lay down there, I knew it was waiting for me. The darkness in the basement felt like a living thing, wrapping around me the moment I crossed the threshold. The air was thick and heavy, filled with a damp, earthy smell that clung to my skin. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, but it did little to dispel the overwhelming sense of dread that churned in my chest. Each step down the creaking staircase felt like a descent into something far more sinister than just a basement. The walls were cold and rough, the stone slick beneath my fingertips as I steadied myself. The journal was tucked under my arm, its presence grounding me, though I couldn't shake the feeling that it had brought me here, that it had guided me to this moment. The sounds began as whispers, faint and unintelligible, like the murmuring of a distant crowd. They seemed to echo off the walls, growing louder the deeper I went. I told myself it was just the old house settling, the wind finding its way through cracks and crevices, but the lie didn't hold. These weren't ordinary sounds. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a narrow corridor. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with jars and boxes covered in dust and cobwebs. The flashlight revealed strange symbols etched into the stone, patterns that matched the carvings on the mirror upstairs. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they weren't coming from the corridor. They were coming from below, beneath the floor. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the corridor, a door loomed, its surface marked with the same symbols I had seen throughout the house. Unlike the other doors, this one seemed alive. The wood pulsed faintly, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The metal was icy cold, sending a jolt up my arm. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had come too far. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous room bathed in a sickly green light. The source of the light was at the center of the room, a pulsating mass that seemed to grow out of the ground like some grotesque, organic thing. Veins of black and red spread out from it, snaking across the floor and up the walls. The whispers became a roar, voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and anguish. My flashlight flickered and died, but it didn't matter. The green light was enough to see by, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted like living things. This was it, the heart of the house. As I stepped closer, the air grew colder, my breath visible in front of me. The journal in my hand seemed to hum, the pages fluttering on their own. I opened it to the final entry, where Aldridge's shaky handwriting offered one last instruction. Asterisk, burn it. Destroy it and the door will close. But beware, it will fight back, asterisk. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the lighter I had grabbed from the kitchen drawer earlier. My hands shook so badly that it took 3 tries to ignite the flame. As the light flickered to life, the mass at the center of the room began to shift. The veins on the floor pulsed faster, the shadows on the walls stretching toward me like grasping hands. Leave, a voice boomed, deep and guttural. It wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a command. I froze, the lighter in my hand trembling. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through my very bones. You don't belong here, it growled. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around my legs and pulling me toward the mass. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my skin and freezing me in place. No, I shouted, struggling against the unseen force. The journal fell from my grasp, landing open on the floor. The green light intensified, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces in the mass, twisted, anguished faces that stared at me with hollow eyes. With every ounce of strength I had left, I flicked the lighter again and brought the flame to the pages of the journal. The fire caught instantly, the flames leaping hungrily across the dry paper. The roar of the voices grew deafening, a sound that shook the very walls of the room. The shadows recoiled, and the mass at the center of the room writhed violently, as though it were in pain. The green light began to fade, replaced by the warm, flickering glow of the fire. The oppressive cold lifted, and I felt the grip on my legs release. But the house wasn't done with me yet. The floor beneath me began to shake, cracks spidering out from the burning journal. The room was collapsing, the walls crumbling inward as the mass let out one final, ear-splitting scream. I ran the door to the corridor just ahead of me. The house seemed to fight me with every step, the floor buckling and the ceiling caving in. I made it to the staircase, my legs burning as I scrambled upward. The whispers followed me, angry and accusing, but I didn't look back. When I reached the top of the stairs, the basement door slammed shut behind me, and the house fell silent. For a moment, I just stood there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The journal was gone, and the lighter had fallen somewhere in the chaos. The house was quiet now, eerily so. The oppressive presence that had hung over it since I moved in was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. But I knew it wasn't over. Something had changed. The house felt hollow, as if the life had been drained from it. But as I turned to leave, I thought I heard a faint sound, like the flutter of pages turning. I didn't stay to find out. I grabbed my coat and ran out the front door into the cold night air. The house stood silent and dark behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. I didn't stop running until I was far away, the echoes of that guttural voice still ringing in my ears. I don't remember much about the drive. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The streets were deserted, the only sound the soft hum of my car's engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It wasn't until I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner that I realized I hadn't planned where to go. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that house. The fluorescent lights of the diner buzzed faintly as I stepped inside, the warmth and hum of conversation a stark contrast to the oppressive silence I had left behind. A waitress with tired eyes greeted me and led me to a booth. I ordered coffee, though I doubted it would calm my nerves. My hands still trembled as I brought the cup to my lips, the bitter liquid doing little to ground me. My mind raced with everything I had seen, everything I had felt. Was it over? Had I truly destroyed whatever was in that house, or had I merely woken something far worse? The bell above the diner's door jingled, and I looked up instinctively. A man in a weathered coat entered, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. He glanced around, his eyes briefly meeting mine before he took a seat at the counter. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the coffee in front of me. But something about him felt off. The waitress approached his seat, and I strained to hear their conversation. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I caught fragments of his words. "How's on Birchwood? Strange things happening?" My blood ran cold. He was talking about my house. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The man turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay, Han?" the waitress asked, her concern evident. I need some air," I stammered, grabbing my coat and heading for the door. Outside, the air was frigid, but it did little to clear my head. The man's words echoed in my mind. How did he know about the house? Was he connected to Aldridge or to the people who had lived there before me? I decided I couldn't leave it unanswered. I went back inside, determined to confront him. But his seat at the counter was empty, the stool still spinning slightly as if he had left only moments ago. The waitress noticed my confusion. "He just stepped out," she said, nodding toward the parking lot. I rushed outside, scanning the area, but the lot was empty. There was no sign of the man, no sound of a car driving away. It was as if he had vanished. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Maybe I hadn't escaped the house after all. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, locking the door behind me and pulling the curtains shut. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside made me jump. When dawn finally broke, I felt no relief. The sunlight seemed weak and pale, doing little to dispel the lingering sense of unease. I knew I couldn't run forever. Whatever had happened in that house wasn't something I could leave behind. With a heavy heart, I decided to return. The drive back to Birchwood Lane felt surreal, as if I were heading toward some inevitable conclusion. When I reached the house, it looked the same as it always had, old, quiet, unassuming. But I knew better. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet sending a shiver down my spine. The air was still and cold, the silence oppressive. I walked through the rooms, half expecting to see the mass from the basement or hear the whispers that had haunted me for weeks. But the house was quiet, empty. In the living room, I found a mirror. It was cracked now, the surface splintered but still intact. I stared at my reflection, distorted and fragmented, and felt a chill run down my spine. Then, faintly, I heard it, a sound that made my blood turn to ice. The soft rustle of pages turning. I turned around, but the room was empty. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I followed the sound to the staircase, the creaking steps groaning under my weight as I ascended. The noise grew louder as I reached the second floor, leading me to the master bedroom. The door was ajar, swinging gently as if caught by a breeze. I pushed it open, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, save for the faint light streaming through the cracked window. But there, in the center of the floor, lay the journal. It was charred around the edges, the cover blackened and brittle, but it was intact. I knelt down, hesitant to touch it. The air around it felt charged, like the static before a storm. As I reached out, the pages began to flip on their own, stopping at the last entry. A single word was scrawled across the page, written in shaky, desperate handwriting. "Run." The whispering began again, louder this time, echoing through the room. The walls seemed to close in, the light dimming as shadows crept across the floor. I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing the journal, I bolted from the room, down the stairs, and out the front door. As I reached the street, I turned back one last time. The house stood silent, dark, and foreboding. But in one of the upper windows, I thought I saw movement. A figure watching me, its face obscured by shadow. I ran, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. I don't know where I'm going now. Maybe I'll burn the journal again or bury it where no one can find it. But deep down, I know the truth. This isn't over. It will never be over. And I don't think I'll ever escape. Story 2. Sure. I'll begin drafting chapter 1 of your horror story. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or if you'd like to review it before I proceed to the next chapter. Here we go. When I first saw the house, it seemed like a bargain. A charming two-story Victorian with a sloped roof, ornate gingerbread trim, and a wraparound porch, all for less than half of what similar homes in the area were going for. It needed some work, sure, but I didn't mind rolling up my sleeves. After the divorce, I needed a project, something to keep me busy, a fresh start in a new town where no one knew my name or my history. The move was a blur of cardboard boxes, tape, and the grunts of the movers as they hauled my sparse belongings into the dusty old house. By evening, I was alone with a faint scent of mildew, the groans of the floorboards beneath my feet, and the distant chatter of crickets outside the cracked windows. My first night in the house was uneventful, save for the odd creak and moan of the old wood contracting in the cool night air. I told myself it was just settling noises, a phrase my mother used whenever I was frightened as a child. I went to bed early, wrapping myself in a cocoon of blankets against the draft seeping in from the ill-fitting windows. I didn't sleep well, but I chalked it up to the unfamiliar surroundings. The next morning, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Klein, a wiry woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a penchant for gossip. She leaned over the white picket fence that divided our yards as I struggled to set my trash bins upright. "Moving into the old Grayson place, are you?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of curiosity. Yeah, just yesterday, I replied, wiping my hands on my jeans. It's got a lot of potential. Mrs. Klein didn't respond immediately. She studied me for a moment, then leaned closer. You might want to make sure you keep your lights on at night, she said cryptically. I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. Why's that? She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the fence. This place has a history. Last tenant left in the middle of the night, screaming about curses and shadows. They didn't even take their things. Her tone was casual, like she was discussing the weather, but her eyes darted toward the house as if it might overhear her. I shrugged it off, but her words lingered in the back of my mind as I went about unpacking. I found evidence of previous tenants in the form of forgotten trinkets. A cracked photo frame tucked in the back of a kitchen drawer, a child's drawing folded into a book left on the mantel. The strangest thing was the mirror in the upstairs hallway, large and ornate, bolted to the wall as if someone didn't want it removed. Its silver frame was tarnished, the glass slightly warped, giving my reflection an unsettling, distorted quality. That night, as I sat in the living room scrolling through my phone, I heard the first noise. A faint shuffle like feet dragging across the floor above me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The house was supposed to be empty. I listened, heart hammering in my chest, but the sound didn't come again. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe a rodent in the walls or the old house settling again. But when I went upstairs to check, I noticed something strange. The mirror in the hallway seemed to have shifted slightly, tilted as if someone had tried to pull it free. I stood there for a long moment, staring at my warped reflection and the faint outline of the room behind me, half expecting to see something move. I didn't sleep much that night, my thoughts looping back to Mrs. Klein's warning and the strange noises. But morning came, as it always does, and the sunlight streaming through the windows made the previous night's fears seem silly and small. Still, as I drank my coffee and stared out at the overgrown backyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone in the house. I spent the next day trying to make the house feel more like my own. I hung up the curtains, arranged the sparse furniture, and unpacked the few personal items I'd brought with me. The living room looked decent enough by the afternoon, though it still smelled faintly of dust and something sharper, like ammonia. I lit a candle to mask the scent and opened a few windows, hoping the fresh air would help. The day passed uneventfully until I went upstairs to set up my bedroom. That's when I noticed something odd. The mirror in the hallway, the same one that had unsettled me the night before, seemed to have shifted again. It leaned slightly to one side as though it were hanging by a single bolt. I hadn't touched it, and I was certain no one else had been in the house. Frowning, I approached the mirror, hesitating when I saw my own reflection. There was something off about it, though I couldn't pinpoint what. My movements felt just a fraction of a second delayed, my face slightly wrong. I shook my head, dismissing the thought, and reached up to straighten the mirror. It didn't budge. Despite its precarious angle, it was bolted so tightly to the wall that it felt immovable. Giving up, I stepped back and decided to ignore it. I had bigger things to worry about, like the peculiar stains on the ceiling of the master bedroom or the faint, persistent rattling sound coming from the pipes in the bathroom. Old houses, I reminded myself. They're full of quirks. By evening, I had settled into a routine, cooking a simple dinner in the outdated kitchen, eating alone at the rickety dining table, and scrolling through job listings on my laptop. I was halfway through an application when I heard it again, the shuffling sound from upstairs. This time, it was louder and more deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving the house in complete silence. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding, before I mustered the courage to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps echoing in the stillness. The hallway was empty, the warped mirror reflecting only the faint glow of my flashlight. I checked every room, opening closets and peering under furniture, but found nothing out of place. It wasn't until I was heading back downstairs that I noticed it, a single muddy footprint on the floor near the mirror. It wasn't mine. The print was larger than my foot, and the tread was unfamiliar. I stared at it, my pulse racing, before backing away and returning to the safety of the living room. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the unease wouldn't leave me. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows felt like a threat. I barely slept, my dreams plagued by indistinct shapes and whispers I couldn't quite make out. The next morning, I decided to ask Mrs. Klein more about the house. I found her in her yard, watering a bed of wilting flowers. Morning, I called out, trying to sound casual. I was wondering if you could tell me more about the last tenants of my house. You mentioned they left suddenly? Mrs. Klein straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. Her sharp eyes studied me for a moment before she nodded. The Petersons. Nice folks at first, but they weren't there long. A few months, maybe. Then one night we heard screaming. Mr. Peterson ran out into the street, shouting about shadows and curses. Never saw them again. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. And before them? She hesitated, glancing at the house as if weighing whether to tell me. There's always been something strange about that place. People don't stay long. Rumors say the original owner, Mr. Grayson, was into some dark stuff. Seances, rituals, that sort of thing. They say he went mad and disappeared. No one knows for sure, but... Her voice trailed off and she shrugged. I thanked her and returned to my house, her words echoing in my mind. Shadows and curses. Seances and rituals. It was absurd, I told myself. Just old town gossip. But as I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, as if the house itself were listening. Determined to distract myself, I threw myself into cleaning. The mirror in the hallway, however, seemed to mock me with its crooked angle and distorted reflection. As much as I tried to ignore it, I found my gaze drawn to it again and again, each time feeling a growing sense of unease. By the time night fell, I was too tired to think about anything but sleep. But as I lay in bed, the noises began again, louder this time. Footsteps. Dragging. A faint, rhythmic tapping. I pressed the pillow over my head, trying to drown it out, but the sound seemed to seep through the walls, invading my mind. And then, just as I was on the verge of sleep, I felt it, a cold breeze brushing against my face. My eyes snapped open, and I turned toward the window, expecting to see it open. But it was shut tight. The breeze came again, and this time, it carried a faint, whispering sound. My heart raced as I sat up, scanning the dark room. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, but I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim light of the moon filtering through the warped glass of the mirror. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I turned to go back to bed, but as I did, I saw something in the mirror, a shadow darker than the surrounding night, standing just behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just an old house with quirks. Something was here with me, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That shadow, the one I'd seen in the mirror, had lingered in my mind all day. Every time I glanced into a reflective surface, I half expected to see it again. But it was gone. Or at least I convinced myself it was. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I'd imagined it. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something was off. The house wasn't just old, it was haunted. I wasn't sure when I'd crossed the line between ordinary creaks and true fear, but it didn't matter anymore. I needed to get to the bottom of whatever was happening here, even if I wasn't ready to admit it out loud. That night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't going to let this house control me. I'd lived through worse. Divorce. Moving to a new town. A haunted house wouldn't break me. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house seemed to come alive with new sounds, louder, more deliberate than before. Footsteps pacing above me, the creak of a door opening, the soft scraping of something moving in the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I went back to the basement, the place I'd been avoiding since I moved in. I wasn't sure why, but something about that part of the house unsettled me. The air was thick, the walls damp and cold, and the narrow staircase seemed to go on forever. I flicked on the light at the bottom, the bulb buzzing as it flickered to life. There, on the floor near the far corner, I saw it. A small leather-bound book half buried under an old chest. The cover was worn, the edges frayed. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the dust-covered surface, and felt a chill run down my spine. The book's pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting. The entries were dated, some from decades ago. The handwriting, at first neat, became more erratic as the pages turned. The first few pages were innocent enough. Descriptions of daily life, the mundane struggles of a man trying to make a home in a house that seemed to always need repairs. But then the tone shifted. I feel it watching me, one entry read. Every time I close my eyes, I see its face. The shadows are moving again. The door has been opened. I stopped reading for a moment, the words sending a cold shiver through me. The door mentioned in the diary seemed to refer to something more than just a physical door. A door to what? I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. I turned the page, my fingers trembling. The next few entries were much more disturbing. I've seen it, a shape in the mirror, always watching. It follows me, moving with the shadows. I can hear its whispering when I sleep. The curse is real. I slammed the book shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air in the basement had grown colder, the walls seeming to close in around me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as if something was in the room with me, something waiting. I ran up the stairs and back into the safety of the living room. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I couldn't stop thinking about the words I'd read in the diary. The curse, the shadow, the door. I had to know more. The next day I went to the local library. Mrs. Klein had mentioned the Grayson family, but I needed more than just rumors. I dug through the old town records, newspaper clippings, and historical documents. It didn't take long before I found something that caught my eye. A story from 30 years ago about the disappearance of a man named Samuel Grayson. The article detailed how Grayson, an eccentric recluse, had become obsessed with the occult. He was known to host strange rituals in his home, and rumors spread that he had attempted to open a portal to another world, a world full of darkness, shadows, and things that should never be seen. The article mentioned how, shortly before his disappearance, the local authorities had received reports of odd happenings in the neighborhood. People hearing voices, feeling cold spots, and seeing strange figures in their peripheral vision. It seemed like the house had been cursed long before I moved in. Grayson's obsession with the supernatural had somehow bled into the very walls of the place, leaving behind a legacy of terror that no one could escape. As I read the article, I felt a growing sense of dread. I wasn't just dealing with an old house. I was dealing with something that had been waiting for someone to come along and open the door, just as Samuel Grayson had. I closed the library books and left, the weight of the knowledge settling in my chest. There was no turning back now. That night, the noises returned, louder, closer, more persistent than ever before. This time, I could hear someone, or something, moving through the house, pacing slowly down the hallway outside my bedroom door. The floorboards creaked under the weight of its steps, each footfall sending a wave of panic through my body. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the air growing colder, a bone-chilling draft slipping through the cracks of the old windows. I knew what I had to do. I had to find the door that Samuel Grayson had opened. But as I stepped out into the hallway, I knew I wasn't alone. The house felt different now, as if it were alive, watching, waiting. The footsteps continued, closer now. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow, as I moved down the hall toward the source of the sound. My fingers brushed against the cold wall, the dim light from the hallway casting long shadows around me. And then, in the dark, I saw it. The mirror. It was no longer crooked, no longer tilted at an unnatural angle. It was perfectly straight, its surface gleaming in the dim light. But as I stared into it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shape standing just behind me. The same dark figure from before, its features indistinct, its form flickering like a flame. Before I could react, the figure lunged toward me and everything went black. I woke up in a cold sweat, my body rigid, my eyes snapping open to a pitch-black room. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. The faint hum of the house, its usual creaks and groans, filled the silence, but something was different. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself was pressing down on me. I sat up slowly, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The mirror, the dark figure, was it a dream? No, I didn't think so. It felt too real, too vivid to be just a nightmare. My hands trembled as I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, flicking it on. The soft yellow light spilled across the room, casting long shadows on the walls, but the mirror was gone. I blinked, heart pounding. The mirror had been right there, right in front of me. But now, nothing. The room was empty still. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I pushed myself out of bed and padded barefoot toward the hallway. My legs felt weak, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I moved, but I couldn't stop now. I needed to know what was happening, what had happened. I walked down the hallway, my pulse thundering in my ears. The house felt different, as though it were aware of me, watching me as I walked through it. I made my way downstairs, each step making the house groan, the floorboards echoing beneath my feet. It was colder than usual, an icy chill creeping through the cracks in the walls and floor. When I reached the living room, I froze. The couch cushions had been rearranged. No, not just rearranged, they were practically thrown about, as though someone had been sitting there, moving around restlessly. My heart skipped a beat. Had someone been in here? Had I forgotten? No, I would have noticed. I turned, the weight of the house pressing against me as I walked toward the kitchen, the chill following me like a shadow. The strange noises had already started again, soft creaks, whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I opened the kitchen door, the hinges protesting loudly, and walked to the counter where I had left my keys. But something was different about the space now. Something off. It wasn't just the cold. It wasn't just the noises. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned abruptly, scanning the room, and that's when I saw it. The front door, which I was sure had been locked, was wide open. I hadn't heard it creak open. I hadn't heard a thing. But there it was. I rushed to it, the fear tightening my chest. As I reached the doorway, I saw it, a shadow darting just beyond the threshold, disappearing into the night. The door slammed shut behind me, sending a shock of cold air through the house. I didn't know what to do anymore. Something was trying to pull me in, something that had lived in this house long before I arrived. I remembered the journal, the mention of the door, the curse. Samuel Grayson's obsession. The figure in the mirror. I needed to find it. The door. I had to know if it was real. I ran back to the basement, my mind racing. There was no time to waste. The house seemed to be alive, its walls alive with whispers and cold fingers that brushed against my skin as I moved through the dark hallway. When I reached the basement, I hesitated. The last time I'd been down here, I'd found the journal. But now, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I stood there, breathing heavily as I scanned the room. There had to be something I missed. A clue. Something to explain all of this. And then I saw it. A trapdoor, small, hidden beneath a layer of dust. It was almost as if the house was trying to keep it hidden. My heart leapt into my throat. I had to open it. I had to know what was down there. The moment my fingers brushed against the handle, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I yanked it open, the door creaking in protest as it revealed a dark, narrow staircase leading even deeper into the earth. I felt a rush of terror. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run. But I couldn't. Not now. I had to know the truth. I stepped down into the darkness, my steps slow and deliberate, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and old wood. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in, the silence broken only by the soft drip of water somewhere in the distance. At the bottom of the stairs, I found another room, small, almost claustrophobic, and covered in dust. A single candle flickered on the ground, casting eerie shadows against the stone walls. And then I saw it. A large, ornate mirror, identical to the one in the hallway. My heart raced. I approached it cautiously, almost as if I were afraid it might reach out and grab me. As I stood in front of it, I felt the same creeping sensation I had felt before. Something was watching me. The figure. I knew it. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold surface of the glass. And then, as if reacting to my touch, the mirror rippled, a wave of distortion rippling across it like water. And then I saw it again. The figure. But this time it wasn't just standing behind me. It was reaching out, its hand stretching toward me, its face twisted and distorted. I recoiled, stumbling back. But it didn't stop. The figure moved closer, its hand just inches from my face, its fingers curling, beckoning me closer. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. A cold, clammy touch. I spun around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the darkness of the basement, and the cold air that seemed to press in from all sides. The mirror seemed to mock me, its surface smooth and unbroken, the figure gone, but I knew it wasn't over. It was still there, watching. I had to get out. But as I turned to leave, I heard something. Footsteps. The unmistakable sound of someone, or something, moving behind me. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, my heart thudding against my chest, my breath shallow and panicked. Each step felt like it was dragging me deeper into some nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The house groaned around me, the air thick with an eerie stillness, but those footsteps, they were right behind me, slow but deliberate, following me up the stairs. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. Something in the air told me that if I did, whatever was behind me would be right there, in my face, cold and unrelenting. I reached the top of the stairs and ran down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the old wooden floors, a staccato rhythm that mingled with the sinister echoes of those footsteps. The door. I had to get out of the house. The front door. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever had been following me, whatever was in this house, it had been waiting for me, and now it was closing in. As I neared the living room, I heard something else. A low, guttural growl. A voice. No, not a voice, but something inhuman. My blood ran cold. The house was alive with sound now. Whispers, breathing, creaking floorboards, and that growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The walls felt as though they were pressing in on me, like the house itself was folding, collapsing under the weight of something dark, something terrible. I reached for the front door, but it wouldn't open. It was locked. I knew it had been locked, but I had locked it. Panic surged through me as I yanked at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear the growl now louder, closer. The air had turned frigid, like winter itself had come to claim me. I turned away from the door, desperate. The windows, maybe I could break a window. But no, I couldn't. I could hear it now, the sound of feet on the floor behind me. Heavy, deliberate steps. I spun around, but again I saw nothing. Nothing but the shadows of the room, dancing in the dim light of the hallway. But I could feel it. It was there. Something was watching me. Waiting. I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over the rug, sending me crashing to the floor. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my elbow as I scrambled to get up. And then I saw it, the reflection in the mirror. At first, I thought it was just my fear playing tricks on me, my eyes wide and unfocused. But no, there it was. The figure, the same one from before, standing behind me, its distorted face twisted in a grotesque grin, its eyes hollow and black. It was as if the mirror itself was showing me something, or someone, that didn't belong. I gasped, scrambling to my feet, but as I looked into the mirror again, the figure was gone. The reflection was just of the room, still and empty, as if nothing had happened. I turned quickly, searching the room again, but I saw nothing. No one. But the growl was still there, just beneath the surface of the silence. It was getting closer. I felt it then. The cold, clammy touch on my arm, as if something had reached out from the shadows to grab me. A sharp, burning cold spread through my skin where it had touched me, the sensation lingering like frostbite. My breath caught in my throat as I yanked my arm away, stumbling back toward the hallway. I had to get out. I had to escape. I ran for the door again, this time with everything I had. My hand found the doorknob again, but it was still stuck, the metal cold and unyielding. My chest tightened, the pressure rising in my throat as I pounded on the door, screaming for help, though I knew there was no one who could hear me. No one to save me. And then, just as I thought I would lose my mind, the door opened. I didn't question it. I didn't look back. I just ran. I burst out into the yard, the night air biting at my skin as I gasped for breath, my legs weak beneath me. But as I ran toward the street, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I whipped around, my heart in my throat, but again there was nothing. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I could feel it watching me, listening. Something was still in there. Something that had been waiting for me to leave, waiting for me to fall into its trap. I didn't stop running until I reached the end of the block, the house a dark shape in the distance. I collapsed against the street lamp, my body shaking, my heart still racing, the taste of fear thick in my mouth. And then, in the distance, I heard something else. A low laugh. I looked back, my blood running cold as I saw the light flicker from the top window of the house. There, in the glass, I could see it. The figure. Its eyes locked onto mine. I turned and ran again, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running. Not even when my lungs burned and my legs screamed for mercy. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance between myself and that house as possible. The streets blurred past me, the night air cold and biting against my skin, but the sound of that laugh, low and mocking, echoed in my mind. It was the kind of laugh that settled deep in your bones, like the prelude to something terrible, something inevitable. I didn't know how far I ran. My head was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, but I couldn't let up, couldn't let myself falter. That laugh, the mirror, the footsteps. By the time I realized how far I had gone, I found myself at the edge of town, far from the house. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers in the dark. I stopped, chest heaving as I looked around for something familiar. A car passed by, its headlights flashing across the empty street. I waved my arms in desperation, but it didn't slow. Of course it didn't. No one ever stops for a stranger at night. I stumbled into the parking lot of a 24-hour convenience store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the asphalt. There was a small bench outside the entrance, and I collapsed onto it, burying my face in my hands, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I tried to calm myself, but the trembling in my hands wouldn't stop. The air around me felt too quiet, too still. There was no comfort in this place, no solace. Only the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. That whatever I had escaped from hadn't truly been left behind. The store door opened with a soft chime, and a middle-aged man with tired eyes stepped outside, carrying a small bag of chips. He stopped when he saw me, clearly taking in my disheveled appearance. I looked a mess, wild-eyed and covered in dirt, my hair a tangled mess from running. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I swallowed hard, trying to speak, but no words came out. My throat felt tight, as if the fear I'd been carrying around for hours had constricted my voice. You don't know what's happening," I managed, the words barely leaving my lips. My voice sounded foreign to me, cracked, broken. The man took a step back, glancing nervously toward the store entrance, then back at me. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he muttered. "Best get home, lady. It's late." I shook my head. I couldn't go back there. Not after what happened. "I can't go back," I whispered, my eyes wild, darting around the empty parking lot as if I expected something to jump out from the shadows. "There's something in that house. Something not right." He looked at me for a long moment, eyes flickering with a hint of recognition before he sighed and scratched the back of his neck. "Look, lady, you ain't the first to say that about that place," he said. "Ain't nobody's business, really. But I've heard things. People talk." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to steady myself. He glanced around again before lowering his voice. "That house, people go in but they don't come out the same. Or they don't come out at all." I blinked. "What are you talking about?" "Who?" He shrugged, tossing the chip bag onto the bench. "Some folks say they've heard things, footsteps, voices, weird stuff. Others, well, they run out of there in the middle of the night, scared out of their minds. Some even claim there's a curse on the place. You ain't the first to look like you've seen something there." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the blood draining from my face. "You mean, like, ghosts?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man stared at me for a moment longer, then shrugged again. "I dunno. Some folks say it's worse than ghosts. Whatever it is, people avoid that house. You should too." I stood up abruptly, my mind racing. "Where is it? The house?" "End of Hemlock Drive. You can't miss it." He turned back toward the store, but I didn't listen to him anymore. The words were already buried in my mind. The house. The history. The curse. I didn't know what I was expecting, but when I turned and looked down Hemlock Drive, I froze. The house was there. It loomed in the distance, dark and brooding, standing in stark contrast to the streetlights that flickered above. But it wasn't just the house that made my stomach drop. It was the light. The soft, flickering glow coming from one of the windows on the top floor. I didn't want to go back. I knew I shouldn't. But something pulled me, something I couldn't explain. Against every instinct in my body, I found myself walking toward it. It was like the house was calling to me. With each step, the air grew colder. My breath was shallow, clouding in front of me like a ghost. I wasn't sure if I was afraid of the house or the thing inside of it. Maybe both. But I knew one thing, the answer was in there. Whatever was haunting me, whatever was pulling me in, I had to face it. I couldn't run anymore. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air felt. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to follow me as I approached. The door was ajar now, and I couldn't help myself. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, the musty, decaying scent of old wood and dampness. The silence in the house was almost suffocating. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. There was no turning back now. I moved through the hallway, my footsteps loud in the silence, and as I passed the mirror in the foyer, I glanced at my reflection. For a split second I thought I saw it, the figure. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I pressed on deeper into the house. The growl. The footsteps. The feeling that something was behind me, closing in on me, pushing me forward. I was going to find it, whatever it was. I felt the weight of the house pressing in on me as I made my way deeper into the darkened hallway. Every floorboard beneath my feet creaked, groaned as if the house itself was waking up, sensing my presence, aware of my every step. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew that I had to keep going. There was something here, something that had been waiting for me. The house smelled like old memories, dust and decay, but beneath that there was something else. A strange, sickly sweetness that made my stomach churn. It was faint at first, but as I moved further down the hallway, it grew stronger, more pungent, like something rotting just beneath the surface. I wanted to gag, but I forced myself to keep going, my eyes scanning the walls for any clue, any hint that could explain what was happening. The shadows were thick in here, as though they were alive, moving in ways they shouldn't. The light from the hallway flickered, casting long, twisting shapes that seemed to stretch toward me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I finally reached the end of the hallway where a door stood ajar. A cold gust of air leaked through the crack, sending a shiver down my spine. I could feel the house's pulse, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to step inside. I pushed the door open. Inside was a small study, furnished with dusty old bookshelves, a wooden desk cluttered with papers, and a chair facing the wall. But what caught my attention wasn't the room itself, it was the journal lying open on the desk, its pages yellowed with age. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest as I picked it up. The cover was worn, the title barely legible. The Last Ritual, it read in faded gold letters. My hands trembled as I opened the journal to the first page. The writing was neat, meticulous, but the words were chilling. Tonight I will summon the spirits. Tonight I will open the door. It is time to call forth what lies beyond the veil. I stopped reading, a lump forming in my throat. The words seemed to burn in my mind, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. Summon the spirits? Open the door? What was this about? I flipped through the pages quickly, each entry more unsettling than the last. Descriptions of rituals, symbols drawn in blood, incantations whispered in the dead of night. And then the last entry. It was dated several years ago, but the ink was still fresh, as if the writer had only just put down the pen. The door is open. I can hear them. They are here. I froze. It was then that I heard it. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from within the walls. A voice? No, not a voice. A growl, deep and inhuman. I dropped the journal in shock, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was moving, shifting around me, coming from all directions at once. I spun around, but the room was empty. Nothing but the shadowy corners, the flickering light from the hallway, and the creeping sense that I wasn't alone. The growl continued, now followed by footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the house, moving closer, circling me. I backed away from the desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but the door I had entered through was no longer there. It had vanished, replaced by a solid wall, smooth and unbroken. Trap. The footsteps grew louder, and then I saw it. From the far corner of the room, a figure slowly emerged from the shadows. Its form was dark, shifting, almost formless, but its eyes, those eyes, glowed in the darkness like two burning embers watching me. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its presence was suffocating. It didn't move, but it didn't need to. I could feel it coming closer, the air growing colder with each passing second. I stumbled back, my pulse racing, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, the space growing smaller, tighter. The growl was now a low, vibrating hum that filled my chest, rattling my bones. And then the air turned icy, so cold that I could see my breath fog in front of me. The temperature dropped, the chill creeping into my very bones. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could focus on was the figure, its eyes, the terrible weight of its gaze. The air thickened, pressing down on me, and suddenly it was there. In front of me, so close I could feel its cold breath on my skin. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, a hand, long and skeletal, fingers twisted and elongated. The moment it touched my arm, a jolt of ice shot through my body, the pain unbearable, as if something inside me had been frozen solid. My knees buckled, and I fell to the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold and foul against my ear. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence. I lay on the floor, staring at the spot where it had been, too terrified to move, too terrified to breathe. The house was still, too still. The growl had stopped. The footsteps had stopped. All that remained was the suffocating quiet. I finally forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. I looked around, desperate for some sign of escape, but the room was still the same. The walls, the desk, the journal, everything was unchanged. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was in this house was still here, still watching, still waiting. And it wasn't going to let me go. I had to leave. I had to get out. But as I turned toward the door, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. They were right behind me. I bolted from the study, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that it drowned out everything else. The footsteps, those heavy, deliberate steps, followed me, getting closer with each passing moment. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air biting at my skin, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was so close to escaping. I ran down the hallway, my feet pounding the floor, each step seeming to echo louder than the last. The house felt alive, shifting, breathing. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards beneath me, the walls groaning as if they were trying to hold me in, trapping me within their decaying grip. The footsteps behind me were closer now, too close. I could almost feel the presence, the weight of whatever was following me. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the sting in my legs, the panic that clawed at my throat. I had to make it to the door. I had to get out. But then, just as I reached the end of the hallway, the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into total darkness. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see anything, not even my own hand in front of my face. But I could feel it. The air had changed. The oppressive silence hung around me, thick and suffocating. And the footsteps, they were gone. For a moment, there was only darkness and silence. Then a whisper. So faint, so soft, I wasn't sure if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But it came again, louder this time, a voice I didn't recognize, murmuring something I couldn't understand. I took a step back, my hands trembling. Was it calling me? My mind raced, panic threatening to overtake me, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving. I took another step, then another, and suddenly the lights flickered back on, harsh and bright. The hallway stretched out in front of me, but it didn't look the same. The walls seemed closer now, the air heavier, like the house itself was pressing in on me. The door to the outside was in sight, just at the end of the hall, but it felt miles away. I pushed forward, but something was wrong. Something was off. The floor creaked beneath me, but the sounds had changed. They weren't normal creaks. They were sharp, almost like claws scraping against wood, coming from all directions. I froze. The footsteps returned, louder than ever, but now they weren't behind me. They were in front of me, moving toward me, steady and unrelenting. I turned, but there was no one there. I couldn't take it anymore. My pulse thundered in my ears as I sprinted for the door. My fingers fumbled for the doorknob, slick with sweat, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Locked from the outside. No. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, almost deafening now. I turned in a frantic circle, desperate to find a way out. I could feel the temperature dropping, the air turning frigid around me. I shivered uncontrollably, my teeth chattering, but the cold wasn't from the house. It was something else. Something inside me. I felt it then, a presence standing just behind me. I couldn't hear its breathing, but I could feel it. The weight of it pressing in on me. And then I heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispering my name. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty hallway stretching out in front of me, the walls closing in. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the floor. The chill of the wood seeped through my clothes, but I couldn't move. I couldn't get up. The whispering came again, this time louder, more insistent. Leave, it hissed, a sound that sent a jolt of terror through my veins. I looked up, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, too tall, its outline shifting in the dim light. Its features were indistinct, like a dark shadow bleeding into the walls, but the eyes were unmistakable. Two glowing amber eyes fixed on me, watching me. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence, its cold, malevolent presence, like a weight on my chest. It was as if it were waiting for something. For me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at those eyes. They were hypnotic, pulling me in like they were calling me toward them. But I knew better. I knew that if I moved toward it, I wouldn't escape. I had to leave. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaky, and lunged for the door. This time, my fingers found the knob, and I twisted it with all the strength I had left. The door creaked open, but as I stepped into the doorway, I heard it. The sound of feet shuffling on the floor. Slow, deliberate. And then the unmistakable sound of breath, ragged and heavy, just behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran into the night, the door slamming shut behind me with a deafening crash. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, my chest heaving, my mind spinning with fear. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes, watching me as I fled. But even now, as I sit here in the safety of my new apartment, I can still hear it. The footsteps, the whispers, the soft, guttural growl of something lurking just out of sight. I don't know if it's still in that house, waiting for someone else to move in, or if it's following me, waiting for me to let my guard down. But I know one thing. I can never go back. The days that followed my escape from that house were a blur. My mind was clouded, filled with fragments of what had happened. The whispering voice, the figure with the glowing eyes, the heavy presence that had followed me, stalking me from the shadows. I tried to push it all away, tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was real. The fear hadn't left me. It clung to me like a second skin, invisible but always there, always waiting to remind me of what I had encountered. Every creak of my new apartment, every shift of the floor beneath my feet, sent a jolt of panic through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that whatever had been in that house had followed me here. At night, the darkness felt thicker, heavier. The silence oppressive, filled with the same whispers I had heard before. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, the old pipes, but the voices, those low guttural murmurs, sounded too real, too close. I hadn't been able to sleep since I left the house. The shadows in my apartment were too familiar, too similar to what I had left behind. I was afraid to close my eyes, afraid that if I did, I would see those glowing amber eyes again watching me, waiting. But I had to sleep. I had to get some rest. One night, after hours of tossing and turning, I finally drifted off, my body too exhausted to fight the sleep that tugged at me. But the moment my eyes closed, I knew something was wrong. The air in the room felt different, colder, heavier. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I opened my eyes, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the darkness of my bedroom, the shadows creeping along the walls, stretching toward me. I was about to dismiss it, about to turn over and try to sleep again when I heard it. A low, distant growl. A sound I recognized. My heart stopped and I froze. The growl wasn't coming from outside the room. It wasn't from the pipes or the wind. It was in here. With me. I held my breath, straining to hear. The growl came again, this time louder, more distinct, and it was followed by a rustling sound, like something moving in the corner of the room. Something big. I turned my head slowly, my pulse racing, and that's when I saw it. A figure just beyond the edge of the bed, standing in the shadows. It was tall, too tall, with a shape that seemed to shift and blur in the dark. The amber eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like two burning coals, locked onto mine. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, as though it were paralyzed by fear. I couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. All I could do was stare at the figure, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The growl grew louder, closer, and I felt the air grow colder still. The figure began to move, slowly, purposefully, gliding toward me with an unnatural fluidity. And then it spoke. The voice was low, guttural, almost inhuman. "You should have never left." I tried to move, to scream, but the words caught in my throat. My chest tightened, and I could feel the weight of its presence bearing down on me, suffocating me, draining all the strength from my body. "You can't escape," the figure continued, its voice wrapping around me like a noose. "You never could." I opened my mouth to speak, but again no sound came out. I was trapped, unable to move, unable to do anything but wait as the figure drew closer, its eyes burning with that same cold, malevolent fire. And then, just as it was almost upon me, the figure stopped. It was as if it had heard something, something distant, something calling it away. The growl faded, and the figure took a step back, its eyes still locked on mine. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there as though it was waiting for me to make a choice. But what choice did I have? With every ounce of strength I could muster, I finally managed to close my eyes. I forced myself to turn away, to block out the image of the figure. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to block out the cold, the darkness, and the terror that had gripped me. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. The room was still. The growl had stopped. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting just outside the door, lurking in the shadows. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this apartment, in this city. Whatever was following me, it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I had to leave again. I had to run. But where could I go? I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay in the apartment, couldn't live with the constant fear that followed me like a shadow, always lurking just out of sight. The house, no, the presence hadn't just followed me from that cursed place. It had found a new home in my mind, in my thoughts, and no matter where I went, it would be there, waiting. The city was a blur as I packed my things in a panic, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped half of what I tried to carry. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat a reminder that I was being hunted. But I couldn't stay, not even another night. I grabbed the few things I could carry, my clothes, a few personal items, and nothing more. I didn't even bother to check the time. It didn't matter. All that mattered was leaving. Getting away from the house, from the figure with the burning eyes, from the growl that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The drive was long, stretching into hours of silence, broken only by the hum of the car engine and the occasional whisper of the wind. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look at the rearview mirror. I didn't need to see anything behind me. I didn't want to know. I didn't even know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving, keep running. Eventually, the landscape around me changed. The lights of the city faded, replaced by the darkness of the countryside. Small towns passed by in a blur, each one just a fleeting memory in the rearview mirror. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that I was far from the apartment, far from the house, far from whatever was waiting for me. I found a small motel at the edge of a town, tucked away in the shadows. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. It looked old, run down, but it was far enough from everything else that I felt a little safer. At least for now. I rented a room, the clerk's eyes briefly meeting mine before looking away, like they knew something I didn't. But I didn't care. I was too tired, too worn down to think about anything else. The room was small, sparsely furnished with a single bed and a nightstand. The air smelled faintly of mildew and the carpet was threadbare. But it was quiet. Too quiet. The silence seemed to press in on me, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I locked the door behind me and sat down on the bed, my mind still racing. The house. The figure. The growl. I couldn't stop seeing it in my mind, couldn't stop hearing the whispers that had followed me from the moment I stepped foot in that place. I tried to sleep, I really did. I lay down, closed my eyes, and waited for the exhaustion to pull me under. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure again, standing in the shadows, waiting. The growl echoed in my ears, a constant reminder of what I had escaped, but not really escaped. The air in the room grew colder. Much colder. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but it didn't help. I felt like something was watching me. I sat up, my breath coming in quick bursts. The temperature had dropped drastically, and now I could see my breath fogging in the air. It wasn't the heater. There was something else in the room, something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to. I stood, my legs shaky beneath me, and moved toward the window. I pulled the curtains back, expecting to see nothing but the empty street outside. But there was something else. Something watching me from the shadows. A figure. Tall just like the one in the house. The eyes. The amber glow. I stepped back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, its presence suffocating like it was daring me to make a move. The growl came next, low and feral, vibrating through the walls, through the floor beneath me. I ran to the door, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the knob. I didn't care about the consequences anymore. I didn't care if I was running straight into its waiting arms. I had to leave. I had to get away. But the door wouldn't open. It was locked, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make it budge. The growl came again, louder this time, almost deafening. My ears rang with the sound of it, and I felt my knees weaken, the fear threatening to swallow me whole. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. And then I heard it, a voice, not the growl, not the whispers. This was a voice I recognized. You can't run anymore. It was the voice from the house, the same low, guttural tone that had whispered my name in the dark. I turned, my body freezing in place, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was standing right in front of me, so close that I could feel the cold radiating from it. Its eyes locked onto mine, and the pressure of its gaze made my chest tighten. And then, in that moment, I realized something. I hadn't escaped at all. It had never left. It had always been here, following me, waiting for the right moment to claim me. The figure reached out, its hand brushing against my cheek, cold as ice. I flinched, but it didn't stop. It only got closer, its breath hot against my ear as it whispered one final time. You'll never be free. I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest as though I had been running for miles. My body was drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around my legs. The room was dim, the early morning light creeping through the thin curtains, but the cold was still there. The same biting, unnatural cold that had filled the room the night before. I could feel it again, that oppressive weight pressing on me, that feeling of being watched. The air felt thick with the promise of something just out of sight, just behind the veil of normalcy. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just another nightmare, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The figure. The growl. It wasn't over. It had followed me here, and there was no escaping it. I had to get out. I didn't care where I went anymore. I didn't care if I drove to the ends of the earth or moved to another country. I had to run. I couldn't stay in this town, not with whatever was stalking me lurking just outside the door. But I knew deep down that no matter where I went, it would follow. It would always follow. I dragged myself out of bed, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. My head was pounding, my thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. I stumbled toward the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to snap myself out of the fog. When I looked up at the mirror, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of my eye. A figure standing just behind me, its shape distorted and blurred, but I knew who it was. The same glowing amber eyes. The same cold presence. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but when I turned, the bathroom was empty. Just the faintest echo of the coldness remained, lingering like a bad memory. It was getting worse. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. I tried to tell myself that I was just tired, that the stress of the past few days had taken its toll. But the truth was, I was terrified. Terrified of what was happening to me. Terrified of the house and whatever had come through the door it had opened. The figure wasn't just following me anymore. It was getting closer. I could feel it, closer than ever before. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through the contacts. Maybe anyone could help me. But the screen was blank. No signal. I checked the Wi-Fi, nothing. I wasn't surprised. This was just another part of the nightmare. Nothing worked here. I stood in the center of the room, feeling like a prisoner in a place that should have been safe. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I wanted to leave, but I had nowhere to go. The road outside seemed endless, and the shadow, that damned shadow, was always there. As if on cue, a knock came at the door. I froze. It was a soft knock at first, almost hesitant, but then it came again, louder this time, insistent. My pulse quickened, my hands trembling as I made my way to the door. The air around me grew colder, and I could almost hear the whispering, that same voice that had followed me for days. I didn't want to open it. I knew who it was on the other side. I knew what it wanted. But I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached for the doorknob, and before I could even process what I was doing, I pulled it open. Standing there in the doorway was a figure, a man tall and unnervingly still. He was dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me with eyes that glowed a faint amber in the dim light. The same eyes. The same cold presence. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was paralyzed by the fear that had taken hold of me, my body refusing to react, refusing to run, refusing to do anything but stare at the figure in front of me. He didn't say anything at first, just continued to look at me with that terrible, unblinking stare. And then, in a voice so low I could barely hear it, he whispered, "You can't escape." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to slam the door shut, to run. But my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, caught in the trap of his gaze, unable to tear myself away. "You'll never escape," he said again, his voice colder now, filled with a malicious promise. "This house, it will always find you." And then, without another word, he stepped forward, his figure melding with the shadows in the hallway, disappearing into the darkness like a phantom. I stood there, my heart racing, my mind reeling. The door swung shut on its own, and I backed away from it, my chest tightening, my breath shallow. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fight this. How to escape the endless cycle of fear and darkness that had taken hold of me. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't stay in this place, in this town, with the figure watching me, stalking me. I grabbed my bag, rushed out of the room, and slammed the door behind me. The hallway was empty, the air still thick with the chill that had settled into my bones. I wasn't safe. I hadn't been safe for days. I ran down the stairs, out into the night, not caring where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away, to find a place where the shadow couldn't follow. But as I stepped outside, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the edge of the parking lot, standing by the trees, was the figure again. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the weight of its gaze, like a vice squeezing my chest. And I realized something. There was no escaping. There never had been. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like invisible hands were squeezing the air from my lungs. The figure at the edge of the parking lot stood perfectly still, its amber eyes reflecting the dim light from the street lamps, as if waiting for me to make my move. I should have turned and run. I should have sprinted in the opposite direction, back to my car, anywhere. But instead, I stood frozen, staring at it, feeling the weight of its presence. Its eyes never left mine. They felt like they were boring into my very soul, and I couldn't look away. The world around me seemed to grow quieter, the air thickening with each second. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its long coat billowing out behind it like a shadow itself. Each step it took sent a shiver down my spine, the sound of its boots crunching on the gravel almost too loud in the dead silence of the night. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones, making my teeth chatter as I stood there, powerless. "You can't run," the figure whispered, its voice a low rasp that seemed to vibrate in the air, sending ripples of dread through my body. "It's too late for that." A scream bubbled up in my throat, but it died before it could escape. My legs trembled beneath me and I felt a strange sensation like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I tried to turn and run. I had to run. But as I took a step, something stopped me. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, to swallow me whole. My feet sank into the pavement as though it were liquid, thick and sticky. I struggled to pull away, but it was no use. The more I tried to move, the more the ground seemed to hold me in place as if it were alive, feeding off my fear. I looked back at the figure, now only a few feet away, and for the first time, it spoke clearly, its voice dripping with malice. Do you think it's just a house? Do you think you can outrun it? It doesn't matter where you go, where you hide. Follows always. It waits always. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came. I was trapped, bound by something I couldn't understand, something that was far beyond me. The figure stepped closer, and the air around me grew colder still. I felt the chill of it brush past me, like a breath on the back of my neck, sending a wave of nausea through my stomach. Its presence seemed to swell, filling the space around me, until the world narrowed down to just me in it. There was no escape. And then it reached out a hand. I couldn't move. I couldn't stop it. The hand hovered inches from my face, its fingers long and thin, the skin pale and almost translucent. I could see the veins running through it, black like oil. The air grew still. The world held its breath. It was just a moment, a single, terrifying moment, but it felt like an eternity. Then, with a suddenness that made my heart jump into my throat, the hand passed through my face, through my body, like I wasn't even there. I gasped, stumbling backward, my head spinning as if I had been struck by an invisible force. My mind reeled. Was it real? Was any of this real? The figure stood there, still and silent, its eyes fixed on me, waiting for something. A cold laugh echoed in my ears, but it didn't come from the figure. It came from everywhere. It came from inside me, from the house itself. The house. I realized then, the house had never been just a house. It had been a prison, a doorway, a place of twisted rituals and dark secrets that bled into everything around it. The figure, whatever it was, had been waiting for someone like me, someone desperate, someone broken enough to fall into its grasp. And I had walked right into it. I could feel the pull again, like the house was calling to me, dragging me back toward it. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards, the whispers from the walls. I turned, trying to run, but the figure's voice stopped me again. You think you can escape? You think you can leave? It taunted. You've already made your choice. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, disappearing into the darkness like smoke in the wind. The world around me seemed to return to normal, just the cold, empty parking lot, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. But I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The house had claimed me and there was no escaping it now. I couldn't go back inside. I couldn't face it, but it didn't matter. It was already inside me. As I stumbled away, my feet moving on their own, I heard something. A faint creaking like the sound of a door opening. I turned around. The front door of the house was wide open, a silhouette standing in the doorway watching me. And I knew that whatever had been lurking in that house, whatever curse it held, it wasn't finished with me yet. It would follow me, always. And as I walked away from the house, the sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging, relentless, followed behind me, growing louder with every step. There was no escape. Not anymore. The house had won. I had just moved to the town. Divorce, new beginnings, and the kind of fresh start that only an empty apartment could offer. The house I found wasn't anything special, just a two-story place tucked at the end of a quiet street, hidden behind tall hedges that swayed in the breeze. The landlord had assured me it was charming, but all I saw was a relic of a past that seemed better left alone. The walls were old, the floors creaked, and the smell of dust lingered in the air as I made my way through the hallways, dragging my suitcase behind me. At first, it was just a quiet house. I was still getting used to the strange sounds, footsteps in the floorboards that seemed too heavy for one person. Sometimes the pipes groaned, and I could hear the faintest hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Nothing out of the ordinary, I told myself, just an old house settling. The neighbors were few and far between, but I met one early on. Mrs. Wilkins, a sharp-eyed woman with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, seemed to know everything about the neighborhood, including the history of the house. She leaned over her fence one afternoon, her voice lowering as though sharing a secret. "You're staying in that house, huh?" she asked, her eyes darting to the windows behind me. I nodded, unsure of where this conversation was headed. Used to be a woman lived there. A strange one. She never talked to anyone, always kept to herself. People said she was different. Did rituals, they say. Stuff you wouldn't understand. I blinked, unsure whether to laugh or be concerned. Rituals? What kind of rituals? She shook her head, her expression clouding. People said she was cursed. That's why no one's ever lasted long in that place. It's been empty for a while now, but the stories stay. I wanted to ask more, but Mrs. Wilkins had already turned away, disappearing behind the bushes with a quiet shake of her head. I stood there for a moment, digesting her words, but I didn't feel the need to take them seriously. Maybe she was just a quirky neighbor, stuck in her ways, trying to add drama to a normal life. It wasn't long before I settled into a routine. The house, as old as it was, didn't bother me. I would work from home, take walks around the neighborhood, and spend my evenings watching TV, trying to unwind from the chaos of the divorce. But slowly, little things began to slip into the back of my mind. There was the tapping. Just a tap here and there, faint but steady, coming from somewhere in the walls. It didn't happen every night, but enough to make me raise an eyebrow. I'd lie in bed, eyes wide open, waiting for it to stop, convinced it was just the house, the old beams groaning. But it didn't stop. It was like someone was pacing around just beyond the wall. One night it got worse. I woke up to the sound of something, or someone, walking up and down the hallway. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I felt a cold draft sweep through my room, though the window was closed, and the air felt strangely thin, as if something was pressing down on me. I tried to ignore it. Just the house, I whispered to myself, rolling over and pulling the covers tighter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The days started blending together. I got used to the creaks of the house, the cold spots that appeared in random corners of the rooms, and the faint noises that seemed to echo when the wind picked up. I even began to tell myself that I was imagining it. Old houses did that kind of thing, right? The air felt thinner in some places, and sometimes the floorboards would creak as if someone had walked past, but when I checked, no one was there. I had settled into the routine of avoiding any thoughts about the odd sounds. Work was keeping me busy, and I could usually escape into a book or a movie by the time night fell. That's when the house felt more alive, more strange. Still, I pushed those thoughts down, telling myself it was all in my head. One evening, as I was coming home from the corner store, I bumped into another neighbor, someone I hadn't seen before. He looked to be in his mid-30s, tall, with short dark hair and a kind of quiet energy about him. He was standing near the mailbox, looking at something in his hands, and when he saw me, he smiled and waved. "Hi there," he said, his voice low but warm. "I'm Daniel, just moved in a couple doors down. Hope you're settling in okay." I waved back, feeling a little awkward. "Yeah, it's been good so far. Just getting used to the place, you know?" "Ah, the house." "Yeah, it's got its quirks," Daniel said, raising his eyebrows as though he had just shared a secret. He took a step closer. "I heard you moved in a couple weeks ago." I nodded, unsure where this conversation was going. "It's a bit of a funny place, isn't it?" he added, glancing at the house behind me. "It's not really one people talk about much, but you're probably figuring that out." I gave a small laugh. "What do you mean?" "Well, you know, people don't stick around long in that house," he said. His voice dropped even lower, as if he didn't want anyone else to overhear. "A couple years ago, a guy lived there. He left one night. Rushed out. I think he was scared out of his mind. Talking about curses, things watching him in the dark. People said he was talking about rituals." I froze, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of the evening. The words felt familiar, too familiar. I had heard those same things from Mrs. Wilkins. "Curses?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed me. Daniel looked around quickly, as though checking to see if anyone was listening. "Yeah, there's a history to that house. You should ask around, but maybe not too much. People get uncomfortable when you bring it up." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, then quickly turned and made my way back to my door. As I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My mind was racing. The stories about the house, the whispers of curses and rituals, they were starting to feel too real. I had no idea what to think. Was it just small-town gossip, or was there something deeper to this? That night, I decided to do a bit of research just to ease my mind. Maybe there were some local records or rumors that could explain what I was hearing. I sat at the small desk in the corner of the living room, my laptop open in front of me. A few searches turned up nothing useful at first, just local real estate listings and some old news articles about neighborhood events. But then I found something. A forum post from a few years ago. The headline read, "Strange Happenings at 136 Oak Street." My heart skipped a beat. That was the house. The post was from someone who claimed to have lived in the house before. They spoke in a frantic tone, describing strange sounds, shadows moving on their own, and a feeling of being watched at all times. The poster mentioned an old journal they had found in the attic, something that belonged to the house's original owner. They claimed that the woman who had lived there had been obsessed with the occult. She'd done rituals in secret deep into the night, and one of those rituals, the post claimed, had opened something that should never have been opened. I couldn't bring myself to read much more. The description of the woman sounded exactly like what Daniel and Mrs. Wilkins had said. The same words, the same fear. I closed the laptop with a snap, my mind racing. I was beginning to believe there was something dark in this house. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to keep myself distracted, work, errands, and the occasional trip to the coffee shop, but my mind kept drifting back to what I had read. That forum post, those chilling stories from the neighbors, and the sudden unease that had crept into my daily life. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was all I could think about. The house was quieter, almost too quiet. The creaks of the floorboards, which had once felt normal, now seemed to echo in the stillness. And at night, the tapping started again. Only this time, it wasn't just the walls. The sound was coming from the attic. Slow, deliberate thuds, as though something was moving around up there, pacing back and forth. I lay in bed, clutching the covers, listening intently, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I mustered the courage to check, the attic door was still locked. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the house settling, the pipes shifting. But the longer I stayed, the harder it was to convince myself. The sounds were getting louder, more persistent, as though whatever it was trying to get my attention. The next morning, I ran into Daniel again. This time, he was standing near the mailboxes, looking a little more serious than usual. "Hey," he said quietly when he saw me. "Can we talk for a second?" I nodded, curious about the change in his demeanor. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I saw you leave the forum post the other night. You're starting to look into it, aren't you?" I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. "How did you know?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "You're not the first person to look. A lot of people have over the years. They try to figure it out, but they get scared, and they leave. The house has a way of making you want to leave." I swallowed hard. "What exactly happened to the people who lived here before?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You really want to know?" I nodded, though a part of me already regretted asking. There were a lot of strange things happening. People heard voices, saw shadows in the corners of their eyes. One guy was convinced someone was following him around the house. And the footsteps, they were always there. But the worst part was the feeling of being trapped. Like you couldn't leave even if you tried. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "That doesn't sound like a normal house." Daniel shook his head. "It's not. You're not safe there. I wish I could explain it better, but I don't really know what it is. All I know is that house it's connected to something. Something bad." He stopped, glancing over his shoulder as though checking if anyone was listening. "Look, I know you've been hearing things. Just don't ignore it. Don't try to pretend everything's fine." I felt a rush of anxiety building in my chest. The quiet dread, the cold spots, the noises, it was all coming together now. But I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. There had to be an explanation, something rational I could latch onto. The idea of leaving felt too final, too much like admitting that whatever was happening was real. "I'm fine," I said, even though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "Thanks though. I'll keep that in mind." Daniel didn't look convinced, but he gave me a small nod and walked away. I stood there for a moment, watching him go, feeling a gnawing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. There was something deeper going on here, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend it was all just my imagination. That evening, as I sat on the couch, I decided to take another look at the forum post. Something about it had been bothering me, something I hadn't fully grasped. I reopened my laptop and scrolled back to the page. The post was still there, but now there was an additional comment. The user who had written the original post had responded to someone else's question. "I found the journal. It's in the attic, hidden beneath the floorboards. The woman who lived here, she knew something was coming. Something she couldn't control. She tried to stop it, but it was too late. It was already in the house." My breath caught in my throat. The attic. The noises. I felt my pulse quicken as I read the last line over and over again. It was already in the house. That night I couldn't sleep. The tapping had returned, louder now, more insistent. It echoed through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. I lay in bed, wide-eyed, listening as the heavy footsteps moved closer to the door. Then suddenly they stopped. A cold draft swept through the room and I heard something else, the faintest whisper like a voice calling my name. come. It wasn't my imagination. I was sure of it. The house was alive and it was calling me. The next morning, I felt a cold weight in my chest. I hadn't slept a wink and the exhaustion was creeping up on me, but my mind was too frantic to focus. I needed to do something. The whispering voice, the footsteps, the sense of something following me, it had all become too real. I couldn't keep pretending that I was just imagining it. The house wasn't just old, it was haunted. I knew I had to check the attic. I had to find out more about the woman who had lived here and the rituals and whatever had been opened. If there was even a chance that the answers lay hidden there, I had no choice but to face whatever waited for me. I couldn't shake the image of the attic, the locked door, the sounds coming from above. My heart pounded just thinking about it, but I wasn't going to back down now. That afternoon, I set out to search the house, starting with the attic. I went through every room, opening cabinets, drawers, and checking every corner I could think of. But nothing felt out of place. Everything looked so ordinary except for that one door. The attic door. It was an old wooden door with a brass handle that had long since tarnished. The door was small, tucked away at the end of the hallway. I had always thought it was a storage closet or a utility room, something that hadn't been touched in years. But after everything I'd read, I knew now it was something more. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. The same door I had passed by every day without giving it much thought. But now it felt different. Now it felt like a threshold, one I wasn't sure I should cross. The door was locked, of course, but it wasn't difficult to find the key. I remembered there was a small drawer in the kitchen where I'd found a random assortment of old keys when I moved in. I dug through the drawer, feeling the cold metal against my fingers until I found the one that fit. My heart raced as I turned the key, the sound of the lock clicking echoing through the empty house. When I opened the door, I was met with an immediate chill. The attic was dark and the musty smell hit me hard. It wasn't the same smell as the rest of the house. This one was thicker, older, like something had been trapped in here for years. I hesitated before climbing up the stairs. The air felt heavy, suffocating almost. The steps creaked beneath my feet as I made my way up, the darkness pressing in from all sides. At the top of the stairs, I reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb was dead. The darkness was absolute. I reached for my phone, using its flashlight to pierce the blackness. The beam flickered, catching on the walls of the attic. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the old wooden beams above creaked under the weight of the house. There were old, forgotten boxes scattered across the floor, and in the far corner something caught my eye. It was a trunk, its leather surface cracked with age. My heart skipped. I had to get to it. Slowly, I made my way over, stepping carefully over old furniture and broken items scattered on the floor. My footsteps felt loud, too loud, breaking the eerie silence of the attic. The closer I got to the trunk, the heavier the air seemed to become. The trunk was old, its metal clasps rusted shut. It had been locked for a long time, but it didn't matter. I wasn't afraid of what might be inside anymore. I needed answers, and I was ready to face whatever lay hidden in that trunk. I pried the clasps open with trembling hands, the rusty metal screeching as I forced it. The lid creaked open, revealing what I had feared to find. Inside, wrapped in yellowing cloth, was a leather-bound book. Its edges were worn, and the pages seemed to have been handled countless times. It looked ancient, as if it had been left untouched for decades. I carefully lifted it out, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The book was cold to the touch, and when I opened it, the first thing I saw were pages filled with symbols, strange, twisted shapes that made my stomach churn. I couldn't understand most of it, but the words on the pages felt wrong, like they were speaking directly to me. I flipped through more pages, my eyes scanning over the strange rituals described in the text. They were dark, and the more I read, the more my heart pounded in my chest. There were mentions of summoning rituals, of opening doors to another world, of calling on something that should never be disturbed. One entry made my blood run cold. Asterisk, beware the door that opens, for once it has been unlocked, there is no closing it. Asterisk. I had to stop reading. The words were too much. The atmosphere around me seemed to shift, becoming heavier, as though something in the house was responding to the book. I could feel it, a presence, a pressure on my chest. The attic felt suffocating, and the air was colder than ever. Suddenly, I heard something. A noise. A scraping sound like fingernails dragging against wood. I froze, the book falling from my hands and landing with a soft thud on the floor. My breath caught in my throat. The sound wasn't just in my mind, it was real. The same noise I had heard in the walls, in the hallway, and downstairs. The same noise that had haunted me every night. It was coming from behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body was frozen, my heart beating so loud it felt like it might burst. The scraping continued, followed by a soft, deliberate step, closer, closer, until I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. And then a whisper, "You shouldn't have opened it." I spun around, but no one was there. But the attic was no longer empty. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The feeling of something hot on my heels, something close enough to breathe down my neck, sent a surge of adrenaline rushing through my veins. I stumbled over the clutter in the attic, barely managing to keep my balance as I scrambled for the door. The scraping noise followed me, growing louder, more frantic, like something was trying to catch up to me, desperate to get closer. As I burst through the attic door, I slammed it shut behind me without thinking. My breath was ragged, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I leaned against the door, trying to steady myself, but the cold that had settled into my bones wasn't going away. It was as if the very air around me had been contaminated, poisoned by whatever had been released up there. I stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at the closed attic door. The sound had stopped, but the silence that followed felt suffocating. It was too quiet, almost like the house was holding its breath. My hands shook as I reached for the light switch, flicking it on, desperate for something to break the eerie stillness. Nothing happened. I cursed under my breath, realizing the power had gone out again. I hadn't even noticed it earlier. It was as if the house was slowly pulling me into its dark depths, one step at a time. I didn't know what I had just unleashed, but I knew it wasn't going to let me go that easily. I turned and fled down the stairs, hoping I could escape whatever that thing was before it decided to get any closer. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped cold. The front door was wide open. I hadn't left it open. I was certain of it. It had been locked when I entered earlier. My mind raced. Had someone else been in the house? No. The scraping had started long before I opened that attic trunk. This wasn't someone else. This was something else, something that had been lying dormant, waiting for its chance to come through that door. The door swung on its hinges as if inviting me to step through, daring me to enter its world. My heart pounded as I hesitated in the doorway, staring out into the night. The wind howled outside, but there was something else, something subtle that made my skin crawl. A figure standing just beyond the threshold, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence. The scraping noise was back, this time from behind me. My head snapped around, and I felt a cold chill seize my spine. A shadow moved across the hallway, growing longer, stretching toward me like fingers reaching out from the dark. The floorboards creaked as it moved, each sound louder than the last, a slow, deliberate march that seemed to echo through the walls. I had no choice but to run. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get out of that house. The air was thick with dread, and every step I took felt heavier than the last, as though the very house itself was trying to pull me back in. I stumbled into the kitchen, heart hammering, desperate to get away from whatever was behind me. The back door was locked, but I didn't care anymore. I broke the window, shattering it with the nearest object I could find. The glass scattered across the floor, and I climbed through the jagged opening, cutting my hands in the process, but I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the urgency to leave. I had to get out. Once outside, I collapsed on the front lawn, gasping for breath as though I had just run miles. My pulse raced and my thoughts were a blur. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. I had opened something in that attic, and now it was awake. I sat there for a moment, my body trembling, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking, the remnants of fear clinging to me. I looked up at the house one last time, and I swear I saw something move in the window. Something large, shadowy, shifting just out of view. I didn't wait to see what it was. I stood up and stumbled away from the house, my feet carrying me farther and farther down the street, away from the thing that had been lurking in that house for so long. My mind was a mess, filled with questions and unanswered fears. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going back. I didn't know what that book had done to me, what it had opened, or how I had unleashed it, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The house was no longer a place I could call home. It had become something else, something dark and twisted. And I was no longer sure I had escaped its grip. I walked for hours, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that house. My thoughts kept drifting back to the house's history, to the woman who had lived there and the rituals she had performed. I hadn't finished reading the book, but I had seen enough to know that whatever had been unleashed, it wasn't something I could just ignore. I had opened a door I couldn't close. Eventually, I found myself on the outskirts of town, my legs aching, my mind foggy from lack of sleep and the weight of everything that had happened. The air felt colder now, a biting chill that I couldn't shake. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched, of being followed crept over me again. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering had returned. It was faint at first, like a murmur in the wind, but then clearer, closer. "Come back." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice wasn't in my head. It was real. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. Nothing but the empty streets, the shadows of buildings stretching out in the dim light. I took a step forward, then another, my feet moving faster as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. And I couldn't help but think, it wasn't asking me to leave. It was asking me to return. I didn't look back again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. It wasn't just the whispers, which seemed to grow louder with each step I took away from the house. It was the gnawing sensation in the back of my mind, the feeling that something, or someone, was closing in. I walked faster, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, my legs aching from the strain. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement, but the world around me felt wrong. The chill in the air seemed to be getting worse, as if the very atmosphere had been tainted by whatever had come out of that house. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that it was the stress of everything, the move, the recent divorce, the overwhelming strangeness of the house, that had made my mind turn on itself. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened. The attic, the book, the strange, unsettling noises, and the things I had felt, seen, and heard. It was all too much. I found myself at the edge of town, staring out at the darkened horizon. The buildings had become sparse, the streetlights fewer. I hadn't meant to wander so far, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. The feeling of being watched was so strong now that I couldn't think of anything but running farther away from the house, from the curse that seemed to be following me. But I had nowhere left to run. I stopped in my tracks, looking around. There was a small park on my left, its iron gates rusted and barely standing. I hadn't noticed it before, but now as I approached it, the emptiness of the place seemed to pull at me, as though it were waiting for me to step inside. I hesitated, but then, against my better judgment, I pushed open the gate. It creaked loudly in the silence of the night, making me wince. I stepped onto the path, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. My eyes scanned the dark, empty park, and I felt a strange tug in my chest, an inexplicable pull towards something in the center of the park. There was a statue, old and worn, standing amidst the trees. It was a figure of a woman, her face obscured by age, her features barely distinguishable. She stood with her arms outstretched, as if beckoning me forward. I shouldn't have gone closer. I shouldn't have done anything that led me deeper into the park, but my feet moved without my consent. Something was calling me, urging me to approach, and for reasons I couldn't understand, I couldn't fight it. Every step felt heavier than the last, the sensation of being drawn into the park growing stronger. The cold air pressed in around me, and as I reached the statue, the ground beneath my feet shifted. My foot slipped slightly, and when I looked down, I saw something strange. A patch of ground, slightly darker than the rest of the dirt, almost as if it had been disturbed recently. It was small, no larger than a patch of sod, but there was something about it that felt wrong. I knelt down instinctively, reaching out to touch it. The ground shifted under my fingers. The earth was soft, almost damp, and I pulled my hand back instinctively, heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, expecting someone to be watching, but the park was still as death, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the trees. I stood up slowly, my heart racing, and began to back away. But something stopped me. A noise, soft at first, like the sound of a distant murmur, growing louder with each passing second. It was familiar. It was the whispering. It was in my head. It was in the air. And this time it was not just a voice. It was words. "Come back." The voice, low and distant, seemed to reverberate through the trees, making the leaves tremble. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one. Nothing. The park was empty, silent, except for the whispers. They were coming from everywhere, circling around me, and I felt a coldness creep into my bones, as if the very air had turned against me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "Come back to us." I turned to look at the statue again, and this time, the figure wasn't quite as it had been. The woman's outstretched arms were no longer just a gesture. They were reaching toward me, her fingers twitching in the darkness. Her face was now partially visible, and though it was blurry, I could make out something. A twisted, contorted smile, painted in shades of gray and black. The ground beneath me trembled again, more violently this time, and I realized the dirt around the statue was shifting. It wasn't just the earth. It was something deeper, something below the surface, pulling itself up toward me. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran back toward the park entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. the whispers now a chorus behind me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. My feet slapped against the gravel, and I barely made it to the gate when I heard the ground shift once more. The whispering became a deafening roar, and in the corner of my eye, I saw a figure emerging from the trees, slowly moving toward me. I didn't stop to see it clearly. I just pushed open the rusted gate and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of town, and even then I kept going, not caring where I was headed, just needing to escape. I didn't look back until I was far away, standing by a small convenience store, panting, drenched in sweat. I didn't see the figure following me, but I heard it. The footsteps were soft at first, distant, but they were getting closer. I should have kept running. I should have kept moving, kept putting distance between myself and whatever was following me. But instead I stopped. I stood there, my breath ragged in my chest, as the faint echo of footsteps grew louder behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel the presence even if I couldn't see it. Every instinct told me to turn and run again, but something in the air was holding me in place. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a split second I thought I saw something. A figure, tall and hunched, its form barely visible in the dim light of the street lamps. It was like a shadow, but it was moving with a deliberate slowness, like it was waiting for me to make a move. I didn't breathe as I watched it, my mind racing with panic, trying to figure out if it was real or just another trick of my overstretched mind. I turned my head away, forcing myself not to look. If I kept moving, maybe it would go away. Maybe it was just my fear playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sounds, the whispers, the footsteps, the sudden cold, none of it was imaginary. It was all too real, and now I was the one being hunted. I started walking again, my steps quick and unsteady, but I didn't dare glance back. Every few steps, I could hear it. Footsteps that were too heavy to be mine, too deliberate. I picked up the pace, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. But no matter how fast I walked, the sound of the footsteps grew louder. They were right behind me. I glanced sideways, and in the reflection of a storefront window, I saw it again. The shadow just behind me, matching my movements exactly. My throat tightened. I broke into a full sprint. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I didn't care if I was running into a dead end or into more darkness. I just had to get away. The streetlights blurred past me as I ran through the empty streets. There was nothing else, no one else, just me and the relentless sound of footsteps following, never faltering. I could hear its breath now, ragged and cold, like something not quite human, just behind me, matching my every step. I ran past the familiar buildings of town, my vision narrowing as the panic took hold. My body ached, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, if I turned around, I knew it would catch me. I didn't even know where I was anymore. My mind was too consumed with the footsteps, the sense of something dark and unnatural pursuing me. And then I reached it, the edge of town, the forest. I didn't stop. I didn't think about it. I just plunged forward into the dark, dense woods at the outskirts of town, hoping to lose it in the trees. The shadows in the forest seemed to swallow me whole as I stumbled over rocks and roots, gasping for breath, my legs screaming in pain, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep running. The footsteps followed. They never stopped. I pushed through the thicket, branches tearing at my clothes, the cold seeping deeper into my skin. My heart was a frantic drumbeat in my chest, but the more I ran, the less I could hear anything but the pounding of my own pulse. Everything around me was thick with shadow, the trees pressing in like they wanted to trap me, to keep me from escaping. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I went down hard, slamming into the damp ground. My breath caught in my throat as I lay there for a moment, unable to move, the weight of exhaustion crashing down on me. And then, just as quickly, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I lay still, my body tense, my senses straining. My pulse rang in my ears as I slowly pushed myself up, taking in shallow, desperate breaths. There was something wrong. I knew it was too quiet. The air had changed. The pressure around me had thickened, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I slowly rose to my feet, but I didn't dare turn around. Something was there. I felt it before I saw it. The air around me turned ice cold, like an invisible hand brushing against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I could feel the presence of something just behind me. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, my mouth dry as dust, but no words came. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my legs felt like stone, frozen in place by a paralyzing fear. And then I heard it, right behind me. A low, raspy breath. A sigh. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't dare look, but I couldn't help it. I slowly turned my head, my eyes scanning the darkness behind me. There, standing just a few feet away, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, and pale, its face obscured by shadows. It was watching me, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The air around it shimmered as if the very space was bending and warping. I froze, and then it spoke. "Come back," it whispered. The words were faint, almost a sigh in the wind, but they felt like ice being driven into my chest. I could feel it like a heavy weight pressing down on me, dragging me closer to the figure, to whatever it was. "Come back to us," it repeated. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything except stare at the thing, at the shape that wasn't quite human. It was something else. Something wrong. And then, before I could do anything, it stepped forward. The world around me exploded with a flash of light and sound. Everything went black. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was back in town, standing at the edge of the forest, the cold air biting at my skin. My heart was still pounding, my body trembling, but the presence was gone. I didn't know how I'd gotten there, or how much time had passed. But I knew one thing. The house. The curse. It wasn't finished with me. Not yet. I woke up the next morning with a strange, lingering sensation that I couldn't shake off. My body was still trembling from the fear I'd felt, but there was something deeper now. Something inside of me had shifted. The woods, the creature, the whispers, they were still there, haunting the edges of my thoughts. But I couldn't just leave. Not yet. There was something pulling me back. I walked back to my house, every step feeling like I was walking in a dream, disconnected from the world around me. The streets were eerily quiet, as though the town had been emptied out, the noise and bustle replaced with an unnatural stillness. My eyes kept darting around, searching for any sign of the thing I'd seen in the woods, but there was nothing. Nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I knew I had to go back. I had to understand what was happening. I had to know why I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something watching from the shadows. It was too much, too terrifying, too overwhelming to just ignore. But it was also a pull I couldn't resist. As I reached my house, the front door creaked open, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The house felt different now. It felt darker, as though it had absorbed the fear I'd left behind and was now ready to give it back to me tenfold. I paused at the entrance and took a deep breath. The air inside was heavy, thick with something unnameable. It smelled like damp earth, but also something sweeter, something rotting beneath the surface. It made my stomach churn. I stepped further into the hallway, my footfalls echoing in the silence. I could hear the familiar creaks of the floorboards beneath my weight, the sounds I dismissed as nothing more than the house settling. But now they felt different, like they were trying to tell me something. Something I didn't want to hear. The temperature seemed to drop as I walked deeper into the house, the chill seeping into my skin. My breath came out in visible puffs as I crossed the threshold into the living room. The walls, once a dull beige, now looked faded, almost sickly, like they were decaying along with everything else in this place. I ran my fingers along the back of the couch, feeling the dust that had accumulated over the last few days. The house felt like it hadn't been lived in for years, even though I knew I'd only just moved in. There were no signs of life, no traces of the people who had been here before. I moved to the bookshelf, the same one I'd seen when I first arrived, now seeming even more out of place than it had before. The books were still there, their spines cracked and faded, but one of them, an old leather-bound journal, caught my eye. It was wedged between two other books, almost as if it had been pushed there on purpose, hidden from view. I took it from the shelf, its weight strange in my hands, and flipped it open. The pages were yellowed, the ink smudged in places, but the writing was still legible. I began to read. The entries were dated decades ago, written by someone named Charles Brackett. The name meant nothing to me, but as I read, I found myself drawn deeper into the words. Charles had been the original owner of this house, and his obsession with the occult was unmistakable. He wrote about rituals, sacrifices, and the feeling that the house was a doorway, a gateway to something beyond this world. The entries grew more frantic as the months went on, his writing becoming erratic, disjointed. He described hearing voices in the walls, seeing shadows moving in the corners of his vision, and feeling an ever-growing presence in the house. He even mentioned the woods behind the house, the very same woods I'd run through the night before. In one entry, he described how he'd opened the door to something in the forest, something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries. And then, in a final chilling entry, he wrote, "I have seen it. It is not of this world. It is coming for me, but I can't leave. I can't escape. It's in the walls. It's in my mind. I can feel it breathing down my neck. The door is open, and now it wants me." The last entry was scrawled in a frenzy, the ink blotting the page. I closed the journal with trembling hands, my mind racing. I had to get out. The truth was staring me in the face. The house, the woods, whatever I had seen last night, it was all connected. The door that Charles had opened had never closed, and whatever had come through was still here. The house was cursed, and so was I. The air around me grew even colder, and I could hear something in the walls. Scratching. Slow, deliberate, like fingers dragging across the plaster. My heart pounded as I stood frozen in place, the journal still clutched tightly in my hands. I couldn't breathe. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was in the walls was trying to break through. I backed away from the sound, my mind screaming at me to leave, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped. Trapped in this house with whatever Charles had brought into this world. And then, as if in response to my fear, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand brushing against my neck. I whipped around, my eyes wide, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. The temperature continued to drop, the air thick with the presence of something unnatural. I could feel it now, right behind me, breathing on my skin. I turned to run, but as I stepped forward, something caught my foot. Something unseen, a tight grip pulling me back. I fell to the floor with a crash, the journal flying from my hands, landing just out of reach. I scrambled to get up, but then I heard it, laughter. Oh, it unhinged. It was coming from everywhere. I had to leave. I had to escape. But when I looked up, I realized that the front door, was no longer where it had been. It was gone. The hallway stretched on, impossibly long, the walls closing in around me. I was trapped. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't human, and it was coming for me. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The figure that emerged from the darkness was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its shape blurred, its outline shifting as though it existed in several places at once. The air grew even colder, and I could see the mist of my breath in front of me, clouding the space between us. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough to make my legs freeze, rooted to the spot. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and with each movement, the air grew heavier. The walls of the house seemed to pulse, breathing in sync with whatever was moving toward me. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I couldn't move, couldn't even think. My mind felt like it was being pulled in 1,000 directions at once, memories flashing by, fragmented and distorted. The thing before me wasn't human. It wasn't even a creature from this world. It was a shadow, a presence, something that existed in the spaces between things. The thing's face, or what passed for a face, was a blank void, like an abyss that stretched into eternity. There were no eyes, no features, just darkness. But as it drew closer, I felt its gaze, a weight on my soul that threatened to suffocate me. My fingers twitched, a desperate attempt to reach for something, anything that could protect me. But my body refused to obey, the fear tightening its grip until I was paralyzed, a puppet trapped in a nightmare. I could hear its voice now, though it wasn't spoken aloud. It was a whisper that seemed to come from within my own mind, a soft, seductive murmur that slid beneath my thoughts like oil. You shouldn't have come, it said, though its lips never moved. The door was never meant for you. I didn't know how it knew. I didn't know how it could have known my thoughts, my fears. But it did. It knew everything. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this horrifying dream. But nothing came out. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. My mind was screaming, but my body betrayed me, held me captive in place. It stepped closer, its cold presence seeping into my bones, chilling me from the inside out. The darkness around it seemed to grow, stretching, consuming everything. The walls seemed to be closing in, the house shrinking, its size warping until I felt like I was suffocating in a box. Do you feel it? The voice whispered again, like the rustle of dead leaves. The weight of it, the curse that clings to you. It is yours now. I shook my head, willing myself to break free, to escape the grip of this entity that had followed me from the woods, from the darkness that had always been there, waiting. But it wouldn't let go. I felt it again, that icy touch on the back of my neck, as though something was standing just behind me, waiting to strike. My skin crawled, my muscles screamed to move, but I remained frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. It stepped closer still, so close now that I could feel its presence, its malevolence wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. The very air seemed to darken, as though it were being drained of light, of hope. Don't you want to know what's behind the door? The voice crooned. The secrets waiting for you in the shadows? The truth you've been searching for? No, I didn't want to know. I didn't want to understand. The truth had already come for me. I had seen enough. This place, this house, was cursed, and so was I. There was no escape. I finally managed to move, my legs trembling beneath me. I turned, stumbling away from the thing, desperate to get away, but I couldn't see. The room had become a blur of shadows and fog, every step taking me further into an unfamiliar labyrinth of dark corridors. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. I dared not turn around. I had to find the door. I had to get out. But the house, no, the entire town, felt like it was closing in around me. The streets were empty. The people were gone. The house was the only thing left, the only thing standing, and it wasn't going to let me leave. I finally stumbled into the living room, and for a moment I thought I saw something. A flicker of light. A glimmer of hope. My gaze snapped toward the window, but the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The woods. The same woods I had run through the night before. But now they were different. Darker. More ominous. The trees were twisted, gnarled, their branches reaching toward the house like skeletal fingers. And in the distance there was movement. Something moving between the trees. I couldn't breathe. It was coming for me. I backed away from the window, my heart racing, my thoughts spinning. There was no way out. There was no escape. I turned back to the room, but it wasn't the same anymore. The walls were breathing, the floors creaking as though something was crawling beneath them. The house was alive and it was calling me. It was hungry. I had to leave. But when I reached the door, I found it. It was locked. The doorknob, once familiar, now felt like a foreign object, impossible to turn. I pounded on the door, my fists pounding against the wood, but the walls around me seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, as if they were pushing back, holding me in place. The laughter started again. Oh, it unhinged. It was everywhere. And then I felt it. The cold hand on my shoulder again, the fingers digging into my skin like ice. I turned, but the room was empty. Just shadows. Empty space. And yet I could feel it, its presence, its hunger, its waiting. I was trapped. The door was locked. The house was closing in. And whatever had been unleashed, whatever Charles had invited in all those years ago, was now coming for me. And it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I couldn't breathe. The cold that had taken root in the room was suffocating now, pressing in from all sides. I reached out, gripping the door handle once more, my fingers numb with terror, but the door refused to budge. The laughter, that low, mocking laughter, echoed louder in my ears, filling my head like a relentless, rhythmic pulse. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. My heart pounded as I spun around, my eyes desperately searching for any sign of movement, any sign of escape. But the room was still, the shadows dark and oppressive. The walls closed in on me, and I could feel the temperature drop even further, my breath visible in the air like a plume of smoke. I needed to think. I had to stay calm. I couldn't lose control. But it was getting harder to focus, harder to separate reality from the nightmare that was swallowing me whole. There was only one thing left to do. I needed to find the basement. If I could get down there, maybe, just maybe, I could find a way out. Maybe there was something in that old journal, some clue that Charles had left behind, something that could end this nightmare. I turned toward the hallway, my legs shaking with each step, my mind racing. I couldn't think about what was behind me. I couldn't think about the cold fingers that had grazed my shoulder. The only thing that mattered was getting to that basement. I stumbled down the stairs, my footfalls echoing in the silence, the creaking of the old wood beneath me sending a chill down my spine. Every step felt like a betrayal, like the house was pulling me deeper into its grip. At the bottom of the stairs, the door to the basement stood in front of me, dark and imposing. The heavy wooden door seemed to beckon me forward, a silent promise of answers, or perhaps more questions. I gripped the doorknob and turned, the rusted metal protesting with a loud screech that made my skin crawl. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black staircase that led down into the unknown. I hesitated, my breath caught in my throat. What would I find down there? Would it be more answers, more secrets? Or would it be the end? I forced myself forward, one step at a time, the darkness swallowing me whole as I descended into the basement. The air down here was thick with dust, the smell of mold and rot clinging to everything. The air felt heavier here, more oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was charged with something unnatural. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, each step carrying me closer to whatever had been hidden down here for so long. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, tucked away in the shadows, was an old wooden chest. The sight of it sent a wave of dread through me, my heart racing as I approached. It was covered in dust, its surface worn by time, but it seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though something within was alive. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there were stacks of old papers, bound journals, and faded photographs. It was the kind of thing one would expect to find in a forgotten attic, but there was something about these items, something about the way they seemed to glow with an eerie energy that made my skin prickle. I rifled through the papers, my hands shaking as I searched for answers. And then I found it. A journal. Charles's journal. I opened it, the pages brittle with age, and began to read. The handwriting was spidery and erratic, but the words were unmistakable. The door is open. I can feel it. I've seen it, heard it. It speaks to me in my dreams. It wants something from me. Something I cannot give. I flipped through the pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. Charles had become obsessed with the house, obsessed with the rituals he had begun to perform. The diary spoke of symbols drawn in blood, of whispers in the night, and of a door that should never have been opened. The more I read, the clearer it became. Charles had awakened something. Something that had been waiting for years, hidden in the darkness, hidden in the walls of this house. And now it was awake, and it was coming for me. The temperature in the basement dropped even further, and I could see my breath, thick and white in the cold air. My pulse quickened as I heard something, a soft scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. I stood up, my mind racing, my eyes darting around the basement. The sound was getting closer, and then I saw it. In the far corner, something shifted in the shadows. A figure, tall, thin. Its limbs elongated in unnatural ways, its body moving like a puppet on strings. It was the same figure I had seen before in the darkness. The same presence that had haunted me since I arrived here. But now it was here, in front of me. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the thing as it moved toward me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drum of terror. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. It was the door. The curse. It was everything that Charles had unleashed, everything that had been waiting for me. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my legs finally responding to the terror that had paralyzed me. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it. The scraping sound. The sound of something following me. And I realized, just before the door slammed shut behind me, that I wasn't alone anymore. It was here. And it wasn't going to let me leave. I ran. I ran through the house, down the hall, into the living room, but the house had changed. The walls were closing in, the air growing thicker, suffocating. The windows were dark, the world outside hidden in shadow. There was no escape, no way out. And as I stood there, frozen in place, I could hear the voice again. "Don't you want to know?" it whispered, slithering through my mind. "Don't you want to know what's behind the door?" I shook my head, but it was too late. The truth had already found me, and there was no escaping it now. The house had claimed me. I couldn't move. The house had become my prison, and with every breath, I felt its walls tighten around me, pulling me deeper into its suffocating grip. The figure, whatever it was still out there, somewhere in the house, lurking in the shadows, watching me, waiting for the moment when I would be too weak to run anymore. I stumbled to the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the doorknob. The cold air outside beckoned, but the door wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself had decided I didn't deserve to leave. I pulled harder, my nails scraping against the wood, but it didn't budge. It was locked and I couldn't find the key. The house was mocking me. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was racing, trying to find a solution, anything that could break the hold this place had on me. The figure wasn't the only thing tormenting me anymore. The house was alive. It was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. I turned back toward the hallway, hoping to find something, anything, that could help. My eyes scanned the walls, the floors, the ceiling. I had to get out. I had to leave before it consumed me. But then I heard it, a faint whisper. So soft, so subtle, it almost sounded like a memory, a thought I wasn't sure was my own. It came from behind me, from deep within the house. "Come closer." I froze. I didn't want to. I didn't want to move an inch, but the voice, it was like a magnet pulling me in. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a threat. It was something worse. It was an invitation. A part of me, some deep, terrified part of my mind, knew I shouldn't listen, knew I should turn around and run. But my body didn't obey. Slowly, almost reluctantly, I began to move toward the sound, each step heavier than the last, each footfall a nail driven deeper into my chest. The whisper continued, a faint echo of something ancient, something that had been here long before I ever stepped foot inside this house. "Come closer." I couldn't stop myself. I walked down the hallway, my legs moving like they belonged to someone else, my feet carrying me toward the source of the sound. It was coming from upstairs. I knew it. It had always been coming from there. I climbed the stairs, my breath ragged, my skin crawling as I moved closer to the darkness. Every creak of the stairs beneath me felt like a countdown, a reminder that time was running out. I had to find the truth. I had to uncover what was waiting for me in that room, the room I had always avoided. I reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner. The door to the room was ajar, and the darkness inside was thick, swallowing everything in its path. The air was cold, impossibly cold, and it smelled faintly of decay, like something had died here long ago. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer." I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The room felt alive with something I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to pulse, and the shadows seemed to reach out toward me, curling around my legs like fingers. And then I saw it. On the far side of the room, in the corner, stood the figure. It was taller than I remembered, its form more defined now, but still shrouded in shadow. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze on me, as if it were staring straight through me, seeing everything I was, everything I feared. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body had turned to stone, frozen by the sheer terror of the thing before me. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing in tighter, suffocating me. My lungs felt like they were being crushed under the weight of something unseen. And then the voice spoke again, but this time, it wasn't the whisper of an invitation. It was something else. Something darker. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice like 1,000 whispers tangled together, a chorus of voices that echoed through my mind. "But now that you have..." The figure took a step forward, its movement slow, deliberate. With each step, the temperature in the room dropped even further, until I could see my breath in the air. The chill settled into my bones, making my entire body tremble. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed by fear. The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden in shadow. I could feel it now, the weight of its presence pressing in on me like a vice. It was close enough that I could hear the soft scraping sound of its feet dragging along the floor, like something that wasn't quite alive. "You are not the first," the voice whispered. "And you won't be the last." I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. But I felt it, something ancient, something powerful, something that had been waiting for me all along. "Why?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The figure stopped. It didn't speak, but in the silence I could feel it. The answer was already inside me. It wasn't just here for me. It was here for anyone who dared to enter. And that's when I realized, it had always been about the door. It had always been about the house. I turned and fled, my legs moving without thought, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I didn't care about the truth. I just needed to get out, to escape before it consumed me too. I ran down the stairs, past the door that wouldn't open, past the windows that wouldn't let me out. I could hear the scraping behind me growing louder, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The house was alive with it, the darkness pulling at my heels. And as I reached the front door, I slammed into it with all my strength, desperate to break free. For a moment, nothing happened. The door didn't open. The house didn't let me go. But then, with a final desperate shove, the door gave way. I burst into the cold night air, gasping for breath, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I didn't stop running. I didn't stop until I was far away from the house, as far as my legs would carry me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. Something had followed me. Something that would never let me go. And as I looked back at the house, I saw it. In the window. The figure. Watching. Waiting. And I knew with a sickening certainty that it was far from over. It was only just beginning.